Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The basement has always been my sanctuary. While others might find the perpetual darkness unsettling, I've always cherished how the concrete walls swallow sound and light, creating a cocoon of absolute stillness. Even at noon in the blazing Kansas summer, down here it remains cold enough to see your breath, dark enough to forget the sun exists. That was before they refinished the floor. The work took 3 weeks last autumn. My parents hired contractors from 2 towns over, men who worked quietly and efficiently, rarely speaking except to mutter among themselves in low tones. They stripped away decades of worn linoleum, revealing original stone underneath that my father said dated back to the 1890s. Beautiful work, everyone agreed. The stone gleamed like wet obsidian after they sealed it. Each piece fitted so precisely you could barely see the seams. The first night after they finished, I descended the narrow stairs with my pillow and blanket, eager to reclaim my summer refuge. The basement felt different immediately. Not just the smooth coldness of stone beneath my bare feet instead of peeling linoleum, but something in the air itself. The darkness seemed denser, more deliberate, as if it were watching me arrange my makeshift bed on the old couch. I dismissed it as imagination. Change always feels strange at first. The footsteps started on the 3rd night. At first I convinced myself it was the house settling, or perhaps field mice in the walls. Old farmhouses make all sorts of sounds, especially when the temperature drops. But these weren't random creaks or scurrying. They were measured, deliberate steps. They would begin at the far end of what my father called the underground corridor, though it was really just a narrow hallway that connected the basement to the old root cellar. Step by step, they would approach my door, pause for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, then continue past. By the end of the first week, the pattern had evolved. The steps would approach, stop directly outside my door, and wait. I would lie there, breathing shallow, counting the seconds. Sometimes it was 30, sometimes 300. Then they would resume, making a complete circuit of the corridor before starting again. I tried recording it once with my phone. The playback revealed nothing but the hum of the air conditioning unit and my own ragged breathing. Yet I know, I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps were real as the cold sweat that would break across my forehead each time they paused at my threshold. The touching began 2 weeks later. I was drifting between waking and sleep, that liminal space where reality becomes negotiable, when I felt it. A single deliberate poke at the sole of my left foot. Not aggressive, not painful, exploratory, testing, like someone checking if meat is done cooking. I jerked upright, heart hammering, fumbling for my phone's flashlight. The basement was empty, of course, just me and the shadows that seemed to pulse at the edges of the light. But my foot still tingled where I'd been touched, a cold spot that wouldn't warm no matter how much I rubbed it. After that, I started sleeping upstairs. Told my parents the basement was too humid, that it was aggravating my allergies. They exchanged one of those looks, the kind parents share when they think their kid is being dramatic, but didn't push it. For 3 nights, I slept in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters and the comfort of windows that let in moonlight. For 3 nights, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then my father mentioned the boundary stones. We were having breakfast, just the 2 of us. My mother had left early for her shift at the hospital. He was reading something on his tablet, frowning at the screen with that expression he gets when he's trying to understand something that doesn't quite make sense. He told me he'd been researching the property's history. The previous owners, an elderly couple who'd lived here 40 years, had apparently removed several old markers when they built the addition that included my beloved basement. These weren't just property markers. They were older, much older, pre-settlement old. The kind indigenous peoples once used to mark sacred ground, or so the article he'd found suggested. His voice dropped as he admitted they'd found one of the stones during the renovation. The contractors had discovered it embedded in the basement wall, mortared in place like someone had tried to hide it, or maybe preserve it. They'd wanted to remove it, but the stone was so deeply integrated into the structure that taking it out might compromise the wall's integrity. So they'd simply worked around it, covered it back up. My coffee turned to ice in my stomach. I knew exactly which section of wall he meant. The hollow-sounding spot I'd discovered years ago but never thought much about. The spot that echoed differently when touched, as if there was space behind it. Or something. That night, despite every rational thought screaming at me to stay upstairs, I found myself descending those narrow steps again. I had to know, had to see. The basement welcomed me with its familiar chill, but now it felt expectant, almost eager. I moved through the darkness without turning on the lights. I knew every inch of this space by heart. My fingers found the wall, traced along the rough concrete until they reached the spot. It was colder here, cold enough to ache. I pressed my ear against it and listened. At first, nothing. Then, so faint I might have imagined it, a sound like breathing. Not human breathing. Too deep. Too slow. Like something massive sleeping just beyond the concrete. I pulled back, and as I did, the footsteps began again. But this time was different. This time they didn't follow their usual pattern. They came straight for me. Fast. Purposeful. The door to the corridor burst open, though I was certain I'd locked it. The footsteps rushed toward me and I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet, landing hard on the new stone floor. The overhead bulb, the one that hadn't worked in years, suddenly flared to life, pulsing with a sickly yellow light. In that stuttering illumination, I saw nothing. The basement was empty, but I could feel it, standing right in front of me, watching, waiting. The light pulsed faster, like a frantic heartbeat, then died completely. In the darkness, something spoke. Not with words, but somehow directly into my thoughts, bypassing my ears entirely. It wasn't angry. It was patient. It had been patient for so long, it could be patient a little longer. But it showed me things, flashes of images I couldn't quite grasp, knowledge that slipped away the moment I tried to focus on it. I understood only one thing clearly. The wall needed to be opened. Whatever was behind it needed to be free. I ran, stumbled up the stairs, slammed the door behind me, and haven't been back since. That was a week ago, but here's what terrifies me most. I want to go back. Every night the urge grows stronger. I dream about taking a sledgehammer to that wall, peeling away concrete and rebar until I reach what's hidden behind it. In my dreams, I'm not afraid. In my dreams, it feels like coming home. My parents have noticed something's wrong. They keep asking if I'm okay, mentioning how pale I look, how I jump at shadows. My father suggested maybe I should talk to someone, get some help with what he carefully calls stress. Maybe he's right. Maybe this is all in my head, some kind of breakdown triggered by too many nights alone in the dark. But then I remember the stone floor, how perfectly those ancient stones fit together, like they were meant to contain something. I remember the breathing behind the wall, patient and eternal. I remember the touch on my foot, testing, checking if I was ready. Last night, I heard the footsteps upstairs for the first time. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I think my time is running out. Either I go down to the basement and open that wall, or whatever's down there comes up to find me. Part of me, a growing part, doesn't see why that would be such a bad thing. After all, it's been waiting so long. It's been so patient. Don't I owe it something for disturbing its rest? My father found me standing at the top of the basement stairs at 3 this morning, hammer in hand. I don't remember getting out of bed. Don't remember picking up the hammer. He took it away, made me promise to stay out of the basement, said we'd brick up the door if we had to. But we both know that won't stop it. Walls couldn't hold it before. That's why someone tried to bind it with the stone. marked the boundaries it couldn't cross. And we removed those boundaries. We invited it in, gave it fresh ground to walk on. The footsteps are constant now, even in daylight. Circuit after circuit, patrol after patrol, checking, waiting. I can hear them even as I write this, directly below my room. The ceiling creaks with each step, though my parents insist they hear nothing. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe the isolation, the darkness, the endless Kansas summers have finally broken something inside me. It would be comforting to believe that, to check myself into somewhere with white walls and soft voices and medication that makes the footsteps stop. But then I look at my foot, at the small round bruise that won't heal where something touched me that night. It's darker now, spreading like ink under my skin, forming patterns that almost look like symbols, like writing in a language that predated words. The wall needs to be opened. This thought isn't entirely mine anymore, but it feels true, inevitable. Whatever's behind that concrete has been waiting long enough. The watching, the walking, the testing, it's all been preparation. For what? I don't know. I'm not sure I want to know. But I'm going back down tonight. I have to. The footsteps have stopped for the first time in days, and somehow the silence is worse than the sound ever was. It's waiting for me. It knows I'm coming. My parents will find this in the morning, I suppose. They'll think I had some kind of breakdown, and maybe that's the truth. Maybe everything can be explained by synapses misfiring, by a mind creating monsters where there are none. Or maybe, when they find that wall broken open, they'll understand why I had to do it. Maybe they'll see what's been walking those corridors, what's been watching and waiting with infinite patience for someone weak enough, or brave enough, or foolish enough to set it free. The sun is setting now. The basement is calling. I'm going home. Story 2. The fever broke on the fourth night, but something else had taken hold of me by then. Something that clung to the walls of that borrowed studio in Bloomsbury like soot on old brick. I'd come to London for research, chasing fragments of Victorian industrial history through archives and museums. The apartment belonged to a colleague who'd gone to Prague for the semester. 3 floors up, narrow windows facing a courtyard where pigeons nested in the eaves and rain collected in perpetual puddles. The radiator clanked like a dying heartbeat, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of a century and a half of footsteps. The illness had struck suddenly. One moment I was cataloging photographs at the British Library. The next I was stumbling through Gower Street with sweat soaking through my shirt despite the October chill. By the time I reached the studio, my hands shook so badly I could barely turn the key. What followed were days of delirium punctuated by moments of terrible clarity. The wallpaper seemed to breathe, its faded pattern of roses expanding and contracting like diseased lungs. Water stains on the ceiling rearranged themselves into faces when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the smell. God, that smell that seemed to seep from the very bones of the building. Sweet and acrid, like lamp oil mixed with something organic, something that had been burning for a very long time. It was during one of those crystalline moments between sleep and waking that I first saw him. The room had grown dark without my noticing, that peculiar London twilight that seems to press against windows like a living thing. I'd been lying on the narrow bed, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling, when movement in my peripheral vision made me turn my head. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the amber glow of the streetlight outside, pale as paper, wearing a battered felt hat that cast his eyes in shadow. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, and even in the dim light, I could see the dark bands that wrapped around his forearms, scars or stains I couldn't tell. They looked like burn marks, or perhaps tattoos, running in parallel lines from wrist to elbow. He raised one hand slowly, palm facing me, the universal gesture for silence. His fingers were long, unnaturally so, and they left dark smudges in the air as they moved. The smell of burning oil intensified until my eyes watered. Then he was gone. Not disappeared, gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I told myself it was the fever. Hallucinations were common with high temperatures. I'd read about it. The brain, overheated and stressed, conjures phantoms from random neural firings. I wrote it off, or tried to, but something compelled me to reach for the notebook on the bedside table. My handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but I recorded every detail. The hat, the pale skin, those terrible marked arms, the gesture for silence. By morning, my fever had broken, leaving me weak but lucid. I spent 3 more days in that studio, recovering, and though I watched for him constantly, the pale man didn't return. The smell of lamp oil faded to a memory, and I began to convince myself that none of it had been real. I returned to my research, though something had shifted in my focus. Where before I'd been interested in industrial revolution machinery and factory conditions, I found myself drawn to the forgotten professions of Victorian London: crossing sweepers, pure finders, mudlarks, the invisible army that had kept the city running, and lamplighters, especially lamplighters. They'd been essential once, these men who'd brought light to the darkness before electricity conquered the night. Every evening they'd made their rounds with their long poles and ladders, igniting the gas lamps that lined the streets. It was dangerous work: gas explosions, falls from heights, and always the risk of burns from the volatile oils they used to prime the wicks. 6 weeks after my illness, I found myself at the Museum of London, wandering through their Victorian collection. The curator had mentioned they'd recently acquired a cache of photographs from a private estate, mostly unpublished images of working-class London from the 1870s. I was examining a display about street lighting when I saw it. The photograph was small, sepia-toned and slightly blurred, but the face was unmistakable. The same pale features, the same felt hat, the same hollow gaze that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. The placard identified him as a lamplighter, circa 1873, name unknown, but it was his arms that made my blood turn to ice water. The photographer had captured him with his sleeves rolled up, revealing the leather straps and metal braces that lamplighters wore to protect their forearms from burns. In the old photograph, they looked exactly like the dark bands I'd seen in my fever dream. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone to photograph the display. The museum guard gave me a sharp look, but I was already moving, already calculating the fastest route back to Bloomsbury. I needed to see that studio again, needed to prove to myself that I'd imagined everything. The key was where I'd left it, under a loose floorboard by the door. The studio looked exactly as I'd left it 6 weeks ago: dusty, cramped, ordinary. Late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating motes of dust that drifted like tiny ghosts. I went straight to the window where I'd seen him standing. At first I saw nothing unusual, then the light shifted, and there they were. Fingerprints on the inside of the windowsill, dark with what looked like soot or coal dust. Fresh enough that when I touched one tentatively, black residue came away on my fingertip. It smelled of lamp oil and something else, something chemical and sharp that made me think of the gasworks that had once dominated this part of London. I stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Perhaps workmen had been in the apartment. Perhaps my colleague had returned briefly from Prague. Perhaps. But I knew none of these were true. The marks were exactly where his hands would have rested as he stood there, watching me in my delirium. That night I stayed in a hotel near King's Cross, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that raised hand, that gesture for silence. What had he been trying to tell me? What warning was encoded in that simple motion? I returned to the museum the next day, spending hours in their archives. The curator, intrigued by my sudden interest in lamplighters, brought me boxes of uncatalogued materials: letters, work schedules, accident reports. London's lamplighters, I learned, had formed a tight brotherhood, united by the dangerous nature of their work and the odd hours they kept. They'd developed their own signals and signs, ways of communicating in the dark streets. One document made me stop breathing for a moment. It was an incident report from 1874, describing a lamplighter who died in a gas explosion on a street that would later become part of modern Bloomsbury. The man had been trying to warn residents about a gas leak, going door to door with increasing desperation. But it was late, and most people were asleep. Those who answered their doors reported that he'd seemed agitated, repeatedly raising his hand for silence as he tried to explain the danger. The explosion had killed him and 12 residents of the building. The building's address was listed in the report. My hands shook as I cross-referenced it with modern street maps. The original building was gone, destroyed in the explosion, and rebuilt in the 1880s. But the location, the location was exactly where the studio stood now. I've tried to return to normal life since then, but normality feels like a costume that no longer fits. Every evening, as darkness falls and I reach for a light switch or lamp, I hesitate. Because now, every single time I illuminate a room, the same thing happens. The lights flicker, just for a moment, as if struggling against some unseen resistance. The bulbs dim and brighten in a rhythm that feels almost like breathing. And that smell, that terrible, sweet smell of burning lamp oil fills the room so completely that I have to open windows to clear it. But worse than the smell, worse than the flickering, is what I sometimes see reflected in darkened windows or mirrors just as the light comes on. A pale figure standing behind me, hand raised in warning, those scarred arms testimony to 100 small burns suffered in service of bringing light to darkness. I've researched obsessively since then, learning everything I can about gas leaks, about the old lamp lighting routes, about the warning signs of disaster that city dwellers in the 1870s would have known to watch for. I've installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room, though I know they're useless against a danger that's more than a century past. I check and recheck the gas lines in my apartment, looking for leaks that aren't there. Sometimes I think he's trying to warn me about something that hasn't happened yet. Other times I wonder if I'm simply losing my mind, if that fever in Bloomsbury broke something in my brain that can't be repaired. But then I smell that lamp oil, see those lights flicker, and I know that the boundary between past and present, between the living and the dead, is thinner than we like to believe. Last week I found something that terrified me more than anything else. In going through my bank statements, I discovered a charge I didn't remember making, a payment to the Museum of London's archive service for reproduction rights. The date was during my fever, when I was supposedly delirious in Bloomsbury. The item requested was a high-resolution scan of a lamplighter's work journal from 1874. The scan was in my email, dated 3 days into my illness. The journal's final entry, written the night before the explosion, consisted of a single line: "They will not listen. I must find another way." Below that, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own fever-scrawled notes, someone had written, "Still trying." I've stopped turning on lights after dark now. I sit in the darkness, waiting, listening for footsteps that never quite materialize, watching for shadows that move independently of their sources. The warning gesture haunts me, that raised hand demanding silence. But silence about what? Silence to hear what? Tonight, as I write this by the light of my phone screen, never an open flame, never anything that burns, I can smell gas. Not lamp oil this time, but natural gas, the kind that flows through modern pipes and modern homes. The smell is getting stronger, and I know I should call someone, should evacuate, should do something. But I also know that no one else will smell it. They never do. The gas leak exists in a London that's been dead for 150 years, in a building that burned and was rebuilt and might burn again if the warning isn't heeded. He's standing in the corner of my room now, clearer than he's ever been. Those leather straps on his arms aren't just protection, they're restraints, holding bandages in place over burns that will never heal. His face is patient but urgent, and that raised hand trembles with the effort of reaching across time. I understand now. The silence he's asking for isn't silence at all. It's listening. He's been trying to tell me something all along, but I've been too frightened, too rational, too modern to hear it. The gas smell is overwhelming now. My neighbors are asleep. History has a way of repeating itself, especially when its warnings go unheeded. I should knock on doors, should sound the alarm, should make them listen even if they think I'm insane. But first I need to turn on the light, just once more, to see if he's still there, to see if the warning in his eyes has changed to approval or despair. My hand hovers over the switch. The darkness presses in, thick with the weight of unheeded warnings and disasters that echo across time. Somewhere in the walls, something hisses. Gas from ancient pipes that shouldn't exist, or perhaps from modern ones that shouldn't be leaking. The smell of lamp oil mingles with natural gas, past and present blurring into a single moment of terrible potential. I flip the switch. Story 3. The desert air tastes different at 3 in the morning. It carries something metallic, something wrong, like pennies left too long in the sun. I know this because I've been awake at this hour every night since we moved into the townhouse on the outskirts of Las Vegas, working in the attic office while she pulls another graveyard shift at the hospital. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way the real estate agent's smile faltered when she showed us the guest room. How the previous tenants left furniture but took every mirror in the house. The neighbor who crossed herself when we introduced ourselves, muttering something in Spanish about La Casa que llama, the house that calls. But the rent was cheap and we needed the space. That first incident happened 6 weeks after we moved in. I was deep in spreadsheets, the attic's single window showing nothing but darkness pressing against the glass like black water. The house had that peculiar silence that only comes in the dead hours, not quiet but holding its breath. Then I heard it. Her voice, clear and casual from the guest room below. My name, spoken like she'd just gotten home and wanted to let me know. Not urgent, not frightened, just normal. I called back that I'd be right down, already saving my work, when my phone buzzed. A text from her with a photo. The hospital parking garage, time-stamped 30 seconds ago. She was just leaving work, would be home in 20 minutes. My hands went cold. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the TV had turned on downstairs. Maybe someone else in the neighborhood had called a similar name. But I knew her voice like I knew my own heartbeat. That had been her, calling from the guest room. I climbed down from the attic slowly, each step on the ladder deliberate and measured. The hallway stretched before me, lit by the single overhead bulb that always flickered at odd intervals. The guest room door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. As I approached, I saw it through the crack, a silhouette settling onto the bed, the mattress springs creaking under invisible weight. My breath caught. I pushed the door open. Empty, but the bed told a different story. There, in the center of the pristine white comforter, was the clear indentation of a body, fresh, deep, the shape of someone who had just been lying there. I reached out with trembling fingers and touched the fabric. Ice cold, bone dry, as if no warmth had ever existed there at all. I backed out of the room, turned on every light in the house, and waited by the front door until she got home. When I told her what happened, she laughed it off, said I'd been working too hard, that the late nights were getting to me. We checked the security footage together, more to ease my mind than anything else. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. The guest room door, clearly visible in the frame, swung shut by itself. No wind, no explanation. Just a door closing on an empty room. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the voice has become a regular visitor. Always hers, always from rooms where she isn't. The kitchen when she's showering, the garage when she's at work, the basement when she's sleeping beside me. Each time the same casual tone, like she's simply letting me know she's there. Each time when I check, I find evidence of presence without the presence itself. A chair still warm, condensation on a window in the shape of a handprint, the lingering scent of her perfume in air that hasn't moved. I've stopped telling her about it. She gets this look now, concern mixed with something else. Fear, not of the phenomena, but of me, of what I might be becoming. The documentation helps. I've filled 3 notebooks with incidents, times, dates, temperatures. The guest room stays 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. The voice only comes between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. It never says anything except my name, never more than once per night. Patterns that suggest intelligence, purpose, patience. Last week, I installed motion sensors. They trigger constantly in empty rooms, always following a path. Guest room to hallway, to stairs to attic. The same route I take every night when I go to work, as if something is learning my routine, rehearsing it. She started working more shifts. Says the hospital needs her, but I see the relief in her eyes when she leaves. The house feels different when she's gone. Expectant, like a theater just before curtain rise. I've begun to wonder if the voice only comes when she's away, or if I only hear it then. The distinction matters less than it should. 2 nights ago, something changed. I was in the attic, the familiar blue glow of my laptop screen the only light. Outside, Vegas sparkled in the distance like a migraine aura, all false promises and neon lies. The voice came as expected from the guest room, but this time, after calling my name, it added something else. Come see. 2 words that shouldn't have terrified me but did, because the inflection was perfect. The exact way she'd say it when she wanted to show me something amusing on her phone, or point out a mistake in my work. Casual, intimate, learned. I didn't go. I stayed in my chair, hands gripping the armrests until my knuckles went white, waiting for dawn. But I could hear movement below, footsteps that matched her gait, the particular way she sighs when she's tired, the creak of the bed as someone settles in for sleep. When morning came and she returned from her shift, I found her standing in the guest room doorway, staring at the bed. The sheets were turned down. The pillow bore the indication of a head. On the nightstand, a glass of water sat half empty, lipstick marks on the rim. Her shade. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with eyes that held questions I couldn't answer. We haven't talked about it since, but I've noticed she no longer goes near that room. Neither do I. The notebooks are filling faster now. The voice comes multiple times each night, always between those cursed hours. It's learned new phrases. Working late again? You look tired. I'm home. Where? Each perfectly mimicked, each spoken to empty air from rooms I can see on the security monitors. Rooms that show nothing but shadows moving without sources. I've started recording everything. Hours of audio that capture nothing but static and my own breathing. The motion sensors map impossible paths through walls. The temperature drops in patterns that spell out words in frost on the windows. Stay. Listen. Mine. She's all but moved out now, though we haven't acknowledged it. She keeps clothes here, maintains the pretense, but she sleeps at the hospital most nights. When she does come home, we orbit each other like binary stars, never quite touching, never quite separating. She looks at me the way you look at someone you used to know. But here's what terrifies me most. I've begun to prefer the voice. It never questions my late hours, never complains about the cold, never looks at me with those careful, frightened eyes. It just exists, calling my name from empty rooms, leaving traces of a presence that might be more real than anything else in this house. Sometimes, in those deep hours when the boundary between awake and asleep blurs, I wonder if I'm the ghost. If she comes home every night to find me in the attic, transparent and fading, typing on a laptop that isn't there. If the voice I hear is her, the real her, trying to call me back from wherever I've gone. The security footage from last night shows something new. At 3:17 a.m., the guest room door opens. A figure walks out. Unclear, distorted, like someone filmed through water. It climbs the stairs to the attic. The motion sensors track it perfectly. In the final frame, just before the camera cuts out, you can see me at my desk, working, and behind me, that blurred figure, leaning down as if to look at my screen. I don't remember anyone being there, but when I check my work from those hours, there are sentences I didn't write, messages in my own style, my own voice, saying things I've never thought. She's not coming back. She was never really here. The house needs someone who understands, someone who listens. Tonight she's at the hospital again, or so her text says. The photo could be from any night. Parking garages all look the same. I'm in the attic, waiting for 3 a.m. for the voice to call. Part of me hopes it will. Part of me knows it's already here, has always been here, speaking through me in words I don't remember saying. The desert air still tastes wrong, metallic and ancient. But I'm getting used to it. The way you get used to any poison, a little at a time, until you can't live without it. The voice is calling now. Not from the guest room this time, but from beside me, behind me, inside me. It sounds exactly like her, but also exactly like me, and I'm no longer sure there was ever a difference. I want to turn around, to see what stands behind my chair, but I can't, or won't. The distinction matters less than it should. My phone buzzes. A text from her, a photo of the guest room, taken from inside. The bed is made, the room is empty. The timestamp is 3 months ago, the night this all started. The message reads, "Who have you been talking to?" I don't know how to tell her that I'm not sure it's been her, that I'm not sure it's been me, that in this house where voices call from empty rooms, we might all be echoes of something that was never quite real, never quite gone. The clock on my screen shows 3:17 a.m. It's shown that for the past hour, or maybe the past 3 months. Time moves differently here, in the space between real and not, between her voice and mine, between the house that calls and the fool who answers. Tomorrow she says she's coming home to talk, to figure things out, to decide what to do about us, about the house, about whatever this has become. But I've checked the security footage from tomorrow, yes, from tomorrow, and it shows the guest room door closing on an empty room, over and over, while someone who looks like her but isn't quite calls my name from places she's never been. I think I'll answer this time. I think I already have. The voice is getting clearer now, and it's saying things she would never say, could never know. About the previous tenants, about why the mirrors were removed, about what happens when you listen too long to something that sounds like love but isn't. The attic window shows nothing but darkness, but in that darkness, I can see the reflection of 2 people at this desk. One is typing, one is watching. Both have my face, or her face, or no face at all. The house inhales, exhales, speaks in voices it's collected over years of calling and being answered. And somewhere, in a hospital that might not exist, she's looking at a photo of me that she didn't take, wondering who's been sleeping in the guest room, who's been drinking from her glass, who's been living her life while she's been gone. But she hasn't been gone. She's been here all along. We both have. We both haven't. The voice calls again, and this time I understand. It's not mimicking her. It's mimicking what I wanted her to be. Story 4. The warehouse breathes differently at night. I've worked here long enough to know its rhythms, the settling of metal shelving when the temperature drops, the hum of fluorescent lights that never quite die, the distant rumble of trucks on I-70. But lately there's something else, a presence that moves through the aisles like memory made manifest, fixing things before they break, solving problems I haven't yet realized exist. It started 3 weeks after the old janitor retired. His name escapes me now, though I worked alongside him for 2 years. Funny how some people fade from memory like that, leaving only impressions. Grease-stained fingers, the smell of WD-40, that peculiar way he'd tilt his head when examining a problem, as if listening to the machinery whisper its secrets. The shelf incident happened on a Friday. I was rushing to fill an order when my shoulder clipped the corner unit hard enough to tear the brackets clean out of the wall. The wood splintered, screws stripped bare. The whole assembly crashed down in a cascade of inventory. Standing there amid scattered boxes, I muttered something about how only the old genius could salvage this mess. The damage looked irreparable. I'd need new brackets, fresh mounting points, probably a whole section of drywall replaced. I left it for Monday, figuring I'd catch hell from management, but too exhausted to care. Saturday morning, I arrived to find the shelf restored. Not just functional, ingeniously repaired. Someone had fashioned a support system using heavy-duty zip ties, a ferrite magnet salvaged from God knows where, and 2 mixing sticks bound with epoxy. The contraption shouldn't have worked, but it held more weight than the original brackets ever did. It was exactly the kind of impossible solution he would have cobbled together, turning garbage into gold through sheer mechanical intuition. I checked the security footage immediately. The cameras showed nothing between closing at 10 and my arrival at 6, just empty aisles bathed in green-tinted darkness. But the audio picked up something, a rhythmic tearing sound between 2:47 and 3:15 a.m., like duct tape being pulled from a roll, measured and deliberate. That should have been my first warning. Since then, I've discovered 17 fixes around the warehouse. A door that would have stuck in the summer humidity now has tiny wooden shims wedged beneath the hinges. The loading dock's hydraulic lift, which I hadn't noticed was developing a leak, sports a patch made from bicycle inner tube and industrial adhesive. The break room microwave, whose turntable had been clicking ominously, now rotates on ball bearings extracted from an old roller skate. Each solution appears before the problem fully manifests, as if someone's reading the warehouse's future, diagnosing ailments yet to come. I've started arriving earlier, staying later, hoping to catch whoever or whatever is doing this. The warehouse feels different during these extended hours. The air grows thick, almost viscous, carrying scents that shouldn't exist here. Machine oil from equipment we don't have, sawdust from wood we've never cut. That particular chemical tang of solder and flux, though we don't do any electronics work. Last Tuesday, I set a trap. Nothing elaborate, just baby powder dusted across the main thoroughfare. If someone was coming in after hours, they'd leave footprints. Wednesday morning, the powder remained undisturbed, but a new fix had appeared. The ventilation grate in the loading bay, which would have rattled loose during Thursday's windstorm, was secured with twisted coat hangers and what looked like hardened bubble gum. The audio that night captured something new, a wet, organic sound, like breathing through liquid. I've started experiencing episodes, moments where I'll be reaching for something and find my hand already holding the exact tool I need. Yesterday, I was thinking about how the shelving in aisle 7 seemed unstable when I discovered I'd already reinforced it with angle brackets I don't remember installing. The work was meticulous, each screw perfectly countersunk, though my hands were clean and I had no memory of the task. The security footage showed me standing motionless in aisle 7 for 43 minutes, staring at nothing while my shadow seemed to move independently, stretching and contracting against the warehouse wall. Sleep brings no relief. I dream of the warehouse expanding, corridors multiplying like cells dividing, each iteration slightly wrong. Shelves at impossible angles, inventory that shifts when I'm not looking, tools that merge and separate like living things. In these dreams, I catch glimpses of him, the old janitor, but his face keeps changing. Sometimes he has too many fingers. Sometimes his joints bend in directions that make my stomach turn. I tried asking my coworkers about him, but their responses disturb me more than the silence. They remember someone was there, someone who fixed things, but the details slip away like water through cupped hands. Even his employee file is gone, leaving only a void in the records where a person should be. The fixes are becoming more elaborate, more preemptive. This morning, I found the entire electrical panel rewired with color-coded cables I've never seen before, preventing a fire that, according to the note left behind in handwriting I almost recognize, would have started next Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. The note was written on paper that felt warm and slightly damp, like skin. I've started finding tools in my pockets that I didn't put there. A ratcheting screwdriver that adjusts to any size. Electrical tape that never runs out. A measuring tape that sometimes shows distances that don't match physical space. When I use them, my hands move with practiced precision, performing repairs I don't understand, creating solutions to problems I can't perceive. The boundary between his knowledge and mine is dissolving. I know things about the warehouse I shouldn't, which bearing will fail in 3 weeks, where moisture will seep through microscopic cracks, how the metal fatigue in the northwest corner will progress over the coming months. This information arrives in my mind fully formed, accompanied by the sensation of grease under fingernails I've kept clean for weeks. My reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes shows oil stains on clothes I'm not wearing. My shadow occasionally carries tools I'm not holding. When I speak, I sometimes hear an echo in a voice that isn't quite mine. offering suggestions for repairs in terminology I don't understand but somehow comprehend. The warehouse no longer needs a janitor because I'm becoming one with whatever remains of him, whatever he left behind or became. The fixes aren't appearing mysteriously anymore. I'm making them during blackouts that consume larger chunks of my day. The security footage shows me working with impossible efficiency, my movements too fluid, too precise, as if I'm being operated by someone who knows exactly what needs to be done. I tried to quit yesterday, drafted my resignation, cleaned out my locker, made it all the way to my car. But I found myself back inside this morning with no memory of returning. 3 new fixes already complete, and grease under my fingernails that won't wash clean. The warehouse needs maintaining. Things break before they break, and someone has to fix them. Someone who understands the language of machinery, who can hear the whispers of failing components, who exists in the spaces between present problems and future solutions. I'm starting to understand why he never really left. The warehouse doesn't let go of those who truly comprehend its needs. We become part of its maintenance cycle, human components in a system that transcends simple employment. He's not gone. He's dissolved into the very structure of this place, and I'm following the same path, one fix at a time. The most terrifying part isn't the transformation, it's how right it feels, how natural it seems to know that the compressor will develop a leak next month, that the security system will glitch during the next power surge, that the foundation will shift 2 millimeters southeast by spring. This knowledge comes with a price I'm no longer sure I haven't already paid. I write this during a brief moment of clarity, though I'm not certain these moments are actually mine anymore. The tools in my pocket are humming, resonating with problems yet to manifest. My hands itch to fix things that aren't broken. The warehouse is calling, and I'm answering in a voice that grows less familiar each day. Tomorrow, someone will find a new fix somewhere in the building. They'll wonder how it appeared overnight, maybe check the cameras, find nothing but strange sounds in the dark. They'll shrug it off, grateful that someone still cares enough to maintain this place. They won't realize that someone is me, and I'm no longer entirely sure what I'm becoming or what I've already become. The boundary between fixing and being fixed has blurred beyond recognition. The warehouse breathes, and I breathe with it, synchronized in a rhythm that predates my employment and will persist long after whatever remains of my individual consciousness dissolves into the maintenance itself. The old janitor never retired. He just changed states, became distributed throughout the building's bones and blood. And now, as I feel my own edges beginning to soften and spread, I understand that this was always going to happen. The warehouse chooses its caretakers carefully, and it never really lets them go. The humming in my pocket grows louder. Somewhere in aisle 12, a problem is about to not happen. My feet are already moving, carrying me toward a fix I'll complete without conscious thought, adding another link in the chain that binds me to this place. I am the fixer now. Or perhaps I always was, and I'm only now remembering a truth that transcends individual identity. The warehouse needs us, and we become what it needs, one impossible repair at a time. The transformation is almost complete. Soon, there will be no distinction between the building's needs and my actions, between its problems and my solutions. We will breathe as one entity, maintaining itself through avatars that once believed they were separate beings with separate lives. This is my last coherent thought as myself alone. The scariest part isn't losing who I was. It's how much of a relief it feels to finally stop pretending I was ever anything other than this. A function, a purpose, a fix waiting to happen in the dark. Story 5. I used to mock ghost stories the way some people mock astrology, with that smug certainty that comes from never having your assumptions challenged. That was before Milwaukee, before the apartment on North Water Street, before I learned that skepticism is just another luxury you can't afford at 3 in the morning when something sits on your bed. The weight pressed into the mattress first, right at my feet. Not suddenly. That would have been merciful. It settled slowly, deliberately, the way someone might sit when they don't want to wake you but need to be close. The springs creaked in that particular pitch that only happens with real weight, not the settling of an old building. My eyes stayed shut, every muscle locked in the paralysis of prey that knows it's been spotted. Then came the fingers. They started at my hairline, cold and papery, dragging through my hair with the tenderness of a grandmother checking for fever. Back and forth, each stroke slower than the last, as if savoring the texture. The smell hit me then, talcum powder and something medicinal, like old bandages left too long unchanged. When I finally opened my eyes, the face was already there, inches from mine. She was ancient in that preserved way, skin pulled tight over bones that seemed too delicate to support even her slight frame. Her smile was the worst part. Not malicious, but serene, patient, like she was waiting for me to remember something important. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, somehow still managed to focus directly on mine. She tilted her head slightly, and I felt her breath on my cheek, sweet and rotten like fruit left in a closed room. The scream never made it past my throat. She placed one finger against my lips. Her nail was yellowed and ridged, and made a soft shushing sound. Then she was gone. Not dramatically, not in a puff of smoke or a fade to nothing. 1 second she was there, the next she wasn't, like a film with a frame cut out. I didn't sleep again that night, or the next 3. By the 4th day, my friend from the office noticed the shadows under my eyes, the way I kept checking over my shoulder. He was one of those evangelical types, attended a conservative church out in Wauwatosa, always trying to save my soul during lunch breaks. When I finally told him, leaving out enough details to maintain some dignity, he didn't laugh. Instead, his face went serious in that way religious people's faces do when they think they've found a new convert. He brought his prayer group the following Tuesday. 4 of them, all in their Sunday best despite it being a weeknight, carrying leather-bound Bibles and bottles of what I assumed was holy water. They walked through my apartment like investigators at a crime scene, touching walls, murmuring prayers, occasionally stopping to whisper urgently among themselves. The leader, an older man with hands that shook slightly, spent an especially long time in my bedroom, pressing oil in the shape of crosses on the doorframe. They told me the apartment was oppressed, their word, not mine. Something about previous tenants inviting darkness, about doorways that shouldn't be open. They prayed over every room, commanded things to leave in the name of various holy figures. The whole production took 3 hours. When they left, my friend gripped my shoulder and told me I'd sleep peacefully now, that faith had won. That night, the sounds started on the fire escape. At first, just the metallic groaning of old iron adjusting to temperature changes. At least, that's what I told myself. But iron doesn't whisper. Iron doesn't form words that almost make sense. Syllables that dance just outside comprehension. The voice was different now, younger, sweeter, like honey poured over broken glass. It would start with compliments, if you could call them that. Comments about the way I breathed, how my pulse looked beneath my skin, how beautifully my eyes reflected fear. I started sleeping with headphones, white noise cranked high enough to damage my hearing. It didn't help. The whispers just moved closer, sliding through the static like oil through water. Some nights I'd wake to find my headphones carefully removed, placed neatly on the nightstand, the cord wrapped with a precision I never used. 3 weeks into this new hell, I decided to investigate the apartment's history. The building manager, a perpetually nervous woman who kept her office door locked even during business hours, told me the previous tenant had left suddenly, no notice, just disappeared one day leaving everything behind. They'd had to clear the apartment themselves, she said. Found it full of odd collections, hair ribbons, pressed flowers, mirrors of every size. That's when I remembered the ceiling. My apartment had those old drop ceilings, the kind made of tiles you can push up to access wiring and pipes. I'd never bothered to look up there. The previous tenant's belongings were supposedly all removed, but standing on a chair in my bedroom, pushing up the tile above my bed, my fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. The compact mirror was small, decorated with tarnished silver roses. The surface was cracked in a spider web pattern, each fracture catching light differently. Wrapped around it was a red ribbon, and tangled in the ribbon were strands of gray hair. So many strands, wound tight like they were meant to bind something. Underneath the mirror was a photograph, water-damaged and faded, showing a young woman standing in front of my building. Her face was scratched out with deliberate, violent strokes, but her hair, long and dark, was circled in red pen, over and over, creating a crimson halo. I should have thrown it all away, should have burned it, buried it, anything but what I did, which was to set it carefully on my dresser and stare at it for hours, trying to understand what it meant. The mirror especially fascinated me. In its cracked surface, my reflection looked wrong, older somehow. Features slightly shifted, like a face remembered from a dream. That night, she came back, but she wasn't alone. I woke to the familiar weight on the bed, the fingers in my hair, but this time there were whispers from the fire escape too, synchronized like a call and response. The old woman's face was closer than before, close enough that I could see myself reflected in her clouded eyes. But the reflection wasn't quite right. In her eyes, I was smiling. She spoke for the first time, her voice like paper tearing. "You look just like him." The whispers from outside grew louder, more insistent. Through the window I could see a shape pressed against the glass, features obscured by condensation that shouldn't exist on a dry night. The shape had long hair that moved without wind, swaying in a rhythm that matched the old woman's breathing. I started spending nights away from the apartment. Hotels, my car, a 24-hour diner where the coffee was terrible, but the fluorescent lights kept everything real and harsh. But I always had to go back eventually, for clothes, for mail, for the pretense of normal life. Each return was worse. Objects moved in subtle ways. A book opened to a different page, shoes pointing toward the bed instead of away, the mirror repositioned to catch my reflection from new angles. The building manager stopped answering my calls. My friend from the church told me I needed stronger faith. That doubt was letting them in. But them implied plurality, implied something coordinated, and I wasn't ready to accept that. I preferred thinking of it as episodes, stress-induced hallucinations, anything but an organized haunting. Last night changed everything. I'd been away for 3 days, crashing on a coworker's couch, making excuses about renovations. When I finally returned, the apartment felt different, lived in. The air was warmer, humid, carrying that same medicinal smell from my first encounter. In the bathroom, the mirror was fogged with steam, and someone had drawn a smiley face in the condensation. The smile was too wide, but it was the bedroom that stopped me cold. The compact mirror from the ceiling was now hanging on the wall, the ribbon tied into an elaborate bow. Arranged on my dresser were more items I'd never seen before. A yellowed tooth, a lock of hair tied with thread, a child's ring too small for any adult finger. Each item was placed with deliberate care, like an altar, or a message I couldn't decode. I sat on the bed, trying to process what I was seeing, when I noticed my reflection in the window. The night had turned the glass into a dark mirror, and there I was, clearly visible. But there was another head above mine, leaning over my shoulder with that same patient smile. I turned, nothing. Looked back at the window, still there, closer now, lips moving in silent conversation with my reflection. My reflection was nodding. I watched, paralyzed, as my reflected self raised a hand and waved. Not at me, at her. They were communicating. My image and this thing, having a conversation I couldn't hear but somehow understood, was about me. About what comes next. About how long they'd waited. The real terror isn't the old woman or the whispers or even the face in the window. It's the growing certainty that they're not trying to scare me away. They're preparing me for something. Each visitation, each moved object, each reflection that doesn't quite match. It's all conditioning, training, like breaking in a horse or teaching a child to swim by holding their head underwater until they stop struggling. I've stopped looking in mirrors entirely now. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll see behind me, but because I'm terrified of what I'm becoming in the reflection. Each glimpse shows me slightly changed. My smile a little wider, my eyes a little cloudier, my posture matching the thing that leans over me. Tomorrow, the building manager is finally returning my calls. She's agreed to let me break my lease. Seemed almost eager when I mentioned leaving. But tonight, I'm here, writing this in the glow of my phone screen because I can't bear to turn on the lights and see the reflections in every surface. The weight is settling on my bed again. The fingers are starting their routine through my hair. But this time, I'm not afraid. That's the worst part. I'm not afraid anymore. My breathing has synced with hers, my heartbeat matching the rhythm of the whispers outside. When she leans close tonight, I know what she'll say. The same words I've been mouthing in my sleep. The ones my reflection has been practicing. Welcome home. The compact mirror on my dresser catches the moonlight, and in its fractured surface, I see myself clearly for the first time. I'm smiling that same serene smile, patient and calm, like I'm waiting for something important to remember itself. I understand now why the previous tenant left everything behind. You can't take these things with you. They're not possessions. They're anchors. Each item ties you a little tighter to this place, this cycle, this inheritance of something that passes from tenant to tenant like a disease that thinks it's a blessing. My reflection waves at me from the window. This time, I wave back. Tomorrow I'll leave. But I know with the certainty of someone who's already dreaming someone else's dreams that I'll return. Not in days or weeks, but years maybe, when I've forgotten enough to think I was crazy. When skepticism becomes a luxury, I think I can afford again. The old woman is humming now, a lullaby that sounds like static, like white noise, like the sound of my own blood in my ears. The whispers from the fire escape have become a chorus, and somewhere in the harmony, I hear my own voice, though my lips aren't moving. It's saying, "You look just like him." I close my eyes and let the fingers continue their work, combing through my hair with all the tenderness of someone welcoming family home. In the cracked mirror across the room, my reflection opens its eyes and smiles. We're all waiting for something. The only difference is some of us have forgotten what. Story 6. The key turned with a reluctance that seemed to echo through my bones, as if the house itself was hesitating to let me in. I'd been maintaining the property on Elmwood Avenue for 3 months now. Weekly visits to air out the rooms, check the heating, and sweep away the dust that accumulated with supernatural persistence in the main bedroom upstairs. Rochester's autumn had been particularly unforgiving that year, and the Victorians' weathered shingles caught every gust of wind with a symphony of creaks and sighs. The realtor, a thin woman with nervous hands, had assured me the job was simple: keep the place presentable for potential buyers, maintain basic upkeep, and ensure nothing went wrong while it sat empty on the market. What she hadn't mentioned were the neighbors. The elderly couple from across the street, the Hendersons, I learned from their mailbox, had approached me during my second week. They spoke in overlapping whispers, finishing each other's sentences with the practiced rhythm of people who'd been married for decades. They'd seen lights, they insisted. The master bedroom window, glowing amber against the November darkness. And figures, 2 of them, moving in slow, deliberate circles behind the sheer curtains. Dancing, the woman had said, her weathered fingers clutching my jacket sleeve. Like they were waltzing, real slow, you know, round and round. Her husband nodded with vigorous agreement. Tuesday night, around 9:30. We were walking the dog when we saw them. Thought maybe you'd started showing the place at odd hours. I'd checked my schedule twice. Tuesday night I'd been 40 miles away, having dinner with my brother in Fairport. The real estate agency confirmed what I already knew. No showings were scheduled, and I was the only one with a key. It should have been easy to dismiss as the overactive imagination of bored neighbors. But when I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom the next morning, I found them. 2 perfect circles pressed into the dust on the hardwood floor, overlapping like a Venn diagram. The impressions were shallow but unmistakable. The outline of dress shoes, one pair slightly smaller than the other, describing a waltz pattern with mathematical precision. I swept them away immediately, thinking dust and old wood could play tricks on anyone's eyes. But when I returned the following week, they were back. Same position, same depth, same haunting symmetry. The pattern became grotesquely predictable. Every time I cleaned those marks, they returned within days. I began timing my visits, checking the floors methodically, documenting their appearance with my phone's camera. The circles never varied, always the same radius, always the same spacing between the partners, as if choreographed by an obsessive ghost. On the fourth week, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The impressions were deeper near the window, as though the dancers had lingered there, swaying in place while gazing out at the street. The thought of invisible performers choosing their stage for maximum visibility to an audience outside filled me with a nausea I couldn't rationalize. I started leaving a small Bluetooth speaker in the room during my visits, playing soft jazz while I worked downstairs. It seemed to help. The marks appeared less frequently, and when they did, they seemed somehow satisfied, less urgent. The house itself felt calmer, as though it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. But calm was relative in that place. December brought the first real snowfall, and with it, a new development that shattered what little peace I'd found. I'd arrived for my usual Wednesday maintenance, stamping snow off my boots in the entryway, when I heard it. The unmistakable creak of floorboards upstairs. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The same tempo as a waltz. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in the doorway, car keys still in my hand. The creaking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying, like a heartbeat with perfect timing. When it stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. I climbed the stairs with legs that felt disconnected from my body, each step an act of will against every instinct screaming at me to leave. The master bedroom was empty, of course, but the dust patterns had changed. Instead of two circles, there was now a single, continuous spiral leading from the center of the room to the window, as if one dancer had been left alone, spinning in increasingly desperate circles. That night, I called the real estate agency and tried to explain. The woman on the phone, a different agent than I'd dealt with before, listened with practiced patience before informing me that the previous caretaker had reported similar disturbances. He'd quit after 6 weeks, claiming the house was affecting his sleep and his marriage. "These old Victorians," she said with forced cheerfulness, "they settle in strange ways. All that wood expanding and contracting." But she couldn't explain the dust patterns. No one could. I began researching the property's history, spending evenings at the local library diving into newspaper archives and property records. What I found was mundane until it wasn't. The house had been built in 1887 by a mill owner for his wife, who had been a ballroom dance instructor before their marriage. They'd lived there for 37 years, hosting elaborate parties with live orchestras in the very room where I now found those ghostly impressions. The mill owner had died in 1924, and his wife had continued living alone in the house until her death 15 years later. Neighbors from that era described how she would play music every evening and dance by herself in the master bedroom, visible through the window, maintaining the routines she'd once taught to others. The house had changed hands 17 times since then. Most owners stayed less than 3 years. Armed with this knowledge, I should have felt some measure of relief, a rational explanation for irrational events. Instead, the information only intensified my growing obsession with the place. I began visiting more frequently, bringing different types of music to see how the house responded. Classical waltzes produced the cleanest, most defined circles. Big band music created looser, more joyful patterns. Silence resulted in that desperate spiral I'd witnessed before, as if the house itself was crying out for accompaniment. The worst discovery came in January, during a particularly brutal cold snap that had left the neighborhood buried under 3 feet of snow. I'd arrived to find the heat had failed, and the house was frigid enough that I could see my breath indoors. I was adjusting the thermostat in the hallway when I heard it again. The creaking upstairs, but different this time. Faster. Frantic. I climbed the stairs with numb fingers wrapped around my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through air so cold it seemed solid. The master bedroom was arctic, but the dust on the floor was disturbed in ways that defied explanation. Multiple sets of circles, overlapping and intersecting like some mad geometric proof. And in the center, pressed into the finest layer of dust, were what looked unmistakably like palm prints. Two sets, as if someone had fallen to their knees. That's when I realized the truth that had been stalking me for months. The house wasn't haunted by the past. It was auditioning for the future. Every time I cleaned those marks, every time I brought music, every time I lingered in that room, I was learning the steps. My feet had begun to follow the patterns unconsciously as I swept, my body swaying to rhythms I couldn't consciously hear. The house was teaching me to dance, preparing me for a partnership I hadn't consented to but couldn't resist. I started having dreams where I was waltzing with a partner I couldn't see, spinning endlessly around that bedroom while snow fell outside the window and neighbors watched from across the street. I'd wake with my legs aching as if I'd been dancing for hours, my apartment's hardwood floors scuffed in perfect circles around my bed. The last time I visited the house was 3 weeks ago. I'd brought no music, no cleaning supplies, no pretense of maintenance. I simply sat in the master bedroom's center and waited, my phone's recorder running, documenting whatever was about to happen. The sun set while I waited. Darkness crept across the floorboards like a rising tide. And then, as the streetlights flickered on outside, I felt it. A presence settling into the space beside me. Not visible, not tangible, but undeniably there, waiting for me to stand, to extend my hand, to take the first step. I understood then that the house had been patient, but its patience was finite. The dancing figures the neighbors had seen weren't ghosts reenacting the past. They were rehearsals for what was coming. An invitation extended to every caretaker, every visitor, every soul who spent enough time learning the steps. The marks in the dust weren't evidence of supernatural activity. They were sheet music, written in a language older than words, teaching anyone willing to learn the choreography of forever. I left without dancing. I had to. But every night since, I've found myself standing in my apartment, moving in slow circles, feeling phantom hands guiding my movements. My neighbors have started giving me strange looks. One mentioned seeing me silhouetted in my bedroom window, dancing alone to music they couldn't hear. Yesterday, I drove past the house on Elmwood Avenue. There's a sold sticker across the realtor's sign, and moving trucks were parked outside. A young couple was directing the movers, laughing and pointing at different rooms, making plans for their new life together. I wanted to stop, to warn them about the music they should never play, the dust patterns they should never clean, the invitation they should never accept. But what would I tell them? That the house collects dancers the way some places collect dust? That every caretaker becomes part of the performance eventually? Instead, I drove home and put on my headphones, hoping the music would drown out the waltz that's been playing in my head for weeks now. But I can still hear it underneath everything else. Patient, persistent, perfect in its three-quarter time. Tonight I think I'll dance along. Just once. Just to see how it feels to finally give in to what the house has been teaching me all along. The neighbors across the street might see a light in my window. They might watch two figures spinning in slow, eternal circles, learning the steps that bind one soul to another in a dance that never ends. But they'll never understand that sometimes the music chooses you. And once it does, all you can do is learn the steps and hope your partner has been practicing too. Story 7. The headlights cut through the desert darkness like twin accusations, their harsh white glare fixed on the door that shouldn't move but does. I've been sleeping in the Chevy for 3 nights now. The driver's seat reclined just enough to let me rest while keeping watch. The engine idles low, a mechanical heartbeat that drowns out the other sounds, the ones I don't want to acknowledge. 37 days on the road, hauling freight from Phoenix to Denver and back again, and I'd counted every mile home to this patch of scrubland outside Flagstaff. The main house sits dark and patient, its windows reflecting nothing, while the annex crouches 20 yards away like something that's learned to wait. I built that addition myself 2 years ago when the mortgage payments started choking me, thinking I'd rent it out to college kids or seasonal workers. Instead, it became my retreat, a place to escape to when the walls of the main house felt too close, too familiar with my failures. But something changed while I was gone. The first sign came with the cold, not the high desert chill that seeps through poorly insulated walls, but something else entirely. A focused stream of frigid air that seemed to pour from the back corner where the lamplight never quite reaches, no matter how I positioned the fixtures. Even with every window latched tight and weather stripping checked twice, that corner breathed winter into the room. I'd stood there on that first night back, unpacking my duffel bag and trying to shake off the road weariness, when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. My breath misted white in the sudden cold, and that's when I saw it. The shimmer. Like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, but inverted. Wrong. The air between me and the wall rippled and bent, distorting the straight lines of the baseboards into something that hurt to look at directly. The rational part of my mind, the part that calculates fuel efficiency and checks tire pressure, offered explanations. Thermal layers mixing, exhaustion playing tricks, the settling of materials and temperature shifts, but explanations felt thin and inadequate when faced with that corner's persistent wrongness. I'd tried to sleep anyway, pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes, telling myself that a month of truck stop coffee and 4-hour power naps had scrambled my perception. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, there was the calling. Not a voice exactly. More like a tugging sensation behind my sternum, as if something had hooked a line to my ribs and was drawing me back toward the annex. I'd made it to the main house around 2 in the morning, stumbling across the hard-packed dirt in my boxers and undershirt, desperate for distance from whatever claimed that corner. But the annex wouldn't let me forget it existed. Every hour, on the hour, the hinges would cry out, a prolonged, rusty screech that spoke of metal fatigue and reluctant movement. The sound carried easily across the gap between buildings, penetrating the main house's walls like they were paper. Each time I'd lie rigid in my childhood bed, listening to what could only be a door swinging open and then pulling closed again, as if someone was checking to see if I'd returned. By dawn, my nerves were frayed to nothing. The salt had been a desperate measure, born from half-remembered folklore and internet superstition. I'd scattered it along the baseboards that second night, working by flashlight to create an unbroken white line around the room's perimeter. Coarse rock salt from the water softener, each crystal catching the LED beam like tiny stars. If something was getting in, something I couldn't see or understand, maybe this would reveal its passage. The morning showed me trails, not footprints, but clear paths through the salt where something had passed without quite touching. Zigzagging routes that avoided every grain, as if whatever moved through the room possessed an intricate awareness of each scattered crystal. The patterns made no sense, doubling back on themselves, creating loops and spirals that suggested movement without purpose, or purpose beyond my comprehension. I'd swept up the salt with shaking hands, telling myself it could have been air currents, could have been static electricity, could have been anything other than what it looked like. But the tremor in my fingers betrayed my certainty. Now, from the safety of the truck cab, I keep vigil. The headlights reveal nothing but a closed door and walls that appear solid in the artificial day their beams create. But at the edges of that illuminated circle, shadows pool deeper than they should. The darkness beyond the reach of the light seems to pulse with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting like something breathing. I've tried turning off the engine, letting true night reclaim the space, but the silence that follows feels pregnant with potential. In that absolute quiet, I can hear it, a sound like settling wood, but too regular, too purposeful. It builds and fades in waves, as if the annex itself is adjusting to some internal pressure I can't fathom. My phone gets no signal out here, has never gotten signal. The isolation that once felt like freedom now presses against me like a weight. The nearest neighbor lives 3 miles down the county road, and we've exchanged perhaps 20 words in the 2 years since I moved here. There's no one to call, no one who would understand if I tried to explain the careful avoidance patterns in disturbed salt, or the way empty air can ripple with intention. Sleep comes in fragments now, micro naps that leave me more exhausted than rest. In those brief moments when consciousness slips, I dream of the corner. In dreams, I can see what lives there. Not clearly, never clearly, but as an impression of movement barely contained within familiar geometry, something that has learned the shape of human spaces but doesn't quite fit them, like a hand forced into a too small glove. The worst part is the certainty that grows stronger each night. It knows I'm watching. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of the annex door standing slightly ajar, though when I turn to look directly, it appears closed and secure. The discrepancy lasts only seconds, but it's enough to make my heart race and my palms slick with sweat. There's intelligence behind these small violations of reality, a testing of boundaries that suggests patience and planning. I've considered leaving. The truck is fueled and ready, my few possessions easily gathered. But where would I go? And what guarantee is there that distance would matter to something that seems to exist in the spaces between what I expect and what I observe? Besides, there's a growing suspicion that leaving might not be possible anymore. Not in any way that would matter. The radio provides some comfort, crackling with late-night talk shows and distant music that reminds me other people exist beyond this bubble of wrongness. But even the voices from outside feel increasingly remote, as if they're broadcasting from a world that's drifting further away each night. On the fourth night, the headlights began to dim. Not the gradual fade of a dying battery, but something more deliberate. The beams would contract incrementally, pulling their protective circle tighter around the truck, leaving more of the annex to sink into darkness. I'd rev the engine, and the lights would surge back to full strength, but only temporarily. Within minutes, they'd start their slow retreat again. The pattern was unmistakable. Something was feeding on the electricity, drawing power away from the systems that kept me safe. I checked every connection, tested the alternator, even replaced the headlight bulbs with spares from the glove compartment. Nothing helped. The lights dimmed with increasing frequency, as if whatever presence occupied the annex was growing stronger, more confident in asserting its influence. That's when I started to suspect the truth that I've been avoiding. The month I spent on the road wasn't the first time the annex had been empty. I'd been gradually spending less time there over the past year, though I couldn't pin down exactly when or why the pattern started. Small things had been driving me away, a persistent feeling of being watched, minor temperature fluctuations, dreams that left me walking to the main house in the middle of the night. What if I hadn't been gradually leaving the annex? What if something else had been gradually moving in? The thought sits in my stomach like a cold stone. If that's true, then my month-long absence wasn't random timing. It was an invitation, a chance for something to settle in completely, to claim the space in ways that went beyond the merely physical. And my return wasn't welcome so much as it was expected. Part of some larger design I'm only beginning to glimpse. The headlights dim again, and this time they don't respond to the accelerator. In the gathering darkness beyond their reach, the annex door stands open. I'm certain it was closed when I looked 5 minutes ago. I'm certain of very little else. The shimmer I saw that first night has spread beyond the corner, rippling across the entire structure like heat waves over the surface of a lake. The building itself seems unstable now, its edges soft and uncertain in the dying light. Through the open doorway, I can see nothing but a darkness so complete. It has texture, depth, dimension. Something moves within that darkness, not toward the door, but deeper into the space, as if retreating to give me room to enter. The invitation is unmistakable, though whether it comes from something malevolent or something that's simply tired of waiting, I can't tell. The engine coughs and dies. In the sudden silence, I hear it clearly for the first time. Not the sound of settling wood or creaking hinges, but something like breathing. Slow, deep respirations that seem to come from the building itself, as if the annex has developed lungs to go with its newfound patience. My hand finds the door handle, though I don't remember deciding to reach for it. The metal is cold against my palm, cold enough to sting. Outside, the air will be warmer than it is in here. But I know that once I step out of the truck, warmth will become irrelevant. Some transitions can't be undone. The breathing grows deeper, more insistent. Whatever lives in the darkness beyond that open door is no longer content to wait. It's calling me home to a place I built with my own hands, but that no longer belongs to me. I look once more at the lights of the main house. distant and fading like stars disappearing into dawn. Then I open the truck door and step into the breathing darkness, leaving the headlights to fail completely behind me. The annex exhales as I approach, welcoming me back to where I belong. Story 8. The smell hit me first. That unmistakable sweetness of cornbread baking. The kind that clings to your clothes and follows you around for hours. I jerked awake in my Minneapolis apartment. The scent so vivid I could taste the golden crust on my tongue. My legs felt warm, weighted down by something that wasn't there when I'd fallen asleep on the couch. The sensation lingered for a moment longer than it should have, like invisible hands adjusting a blanket that had never been pulled over me. 3:17 a.m. according to the cable box. The apartment was dark except for the green glow of the oven display, which shouldn't have been on at all. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor that always creaked in the same spots no matter how carefully I stepped. The cornbread smell grew stronger, impossibly strong for an empty apartment with no ingredients, no mixing bowls, no grandmother standing at the counter with flour dusting her apron. That's when I saw it. Grandmother's recipe book lay open on the counter, its yellowed pages catching what little light filtered through the window from the street lamp outside. The spine was cracked from decades of use, the brown leather cover worn smooth by countless hands. I hadn't touched it in weeks, hadn't even looked at it since unpacking it from the moving box 3 months ago. Yet there it was, open to a page I'd never seen before, marked with a faded purple ribbon that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, that careful script she'd taught herself as a young woman, each letter formed with deliberate precision. But these words, written in pencil so faint I had to lean close to read them, made my skin crawl. When you can't come back, warm the house like this, 375 degrees. Let them know you're still here. Below the note, in the same ghostly handwriting, the boy needs to understand. My hands trembled as I reached for the book, but stopped short when I noticed the oven display. 375 degrees, the exact temperature from the note. The preheat light glowed steadily, as if the oven had been warming for hours. I spun around, checking the door locks, the windows, searching for any sign that someone had been in my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The dishes in the sink, the pile of mail on the table, my work clothes draped over the chair. Nothing disturbed except for the book that had somehow opened itself and the oven that had somehow turned on. My phone buzzed against the coffee table where I'd left it. A text from my aunt. Need to talk. Important. Another buzz, this time from my cousin. Family meeting tomorrow. About grandmother. I stared at the messages, my throat tightening. Nobody had mentioned grandmother in months, not since the day she'd simply disappeared from her house. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty room and a family that suddenly couldn't meet my eyes when I asked where she'd gone. The oven clicked, the sound sharp in the silence. The preheat light went out. I closed the recipe book with shaking hands, but as soon as the cover touched the pages, it fell open again to the same spot. The ribbon lay across the mysterious note like a bookmark placed by careful fingers. I tried closing it again, pressing down hard on the cover, but it sprang open with the persistence of something alive. That's when I heard it, a soft humming coming from somewhere behind me. The melody was achingly familiar, something grandmother used to sing while she worked in her kitchen, flower in her hair and love in her voice. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see, but found only empty air and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The humming stopped. I grabbed the book and shoved it into the drawer beneath the microwave, slamming it shut and backing away from the counter. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, watching the kitchen from across the room, waiting for something to move or change or reveal itself. The oven stayed off, but I could swear I heard it clicking occasionally, the sound of metal expanding and contracting as if it were cooling down from recent use. When dawn finally came, I found myself staring at the drawer where I'd hidden the book. It was slightly open, just a crack, as if something inside were trying to push its way out. The family meeting was held at my uncle's house, a sterile suburban box that smelled of air freshener and unspoken secrets. Everyone was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, all wearing the same carefully neutral expressions I'd come to know and dread. My aunt cleared her throat and folded her hands. "We wanted you to know that grandmother has been moved to a facility where she can receive proper care." The words felt rehearsed, hollow. I asked what facility, what kind of care, when I could visit. The answers came in the same mechanical tone. Specialized treatment. Very private. Visits weren't recommended at this time. For her own good, they assured me. For everyone's good. I pressed harder, demanding specifics, but the family exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. Finally, my uncle leaned forward with a look that was almost pitying. "She's been having episodes," he said quietly. "Confusion. She's been talking to people who aren't there, leaving the house at night, showing up at neighbors' doors asking for people who died years ago. The doctors think it's best if she has some time to adjust to her new environment without the stress of visitors." The explanation felt wrong, incomplete, like a story with half the pages torn out. Grandmother had been sharp as ever the last time I'd seen her, teaching me to fold dumplings with the same patient precision she'd shown when I was 8 years old. There had been no confusion, no episodes, no signs of the deterioration they described. But I didn't argue. I nodded and accepted their cups of coffee and their reassurances that it was all for the best. What else could I do? Fight a decision that had already been made? Demand answers from people who had clearly agreed never to give them? I drove back to Minneapolis in a haze, my mind churning with questions and suspicions. The recipe book called to me from its hiding place, but I resisted the urge to look at it again. Whatever was happening, whatever had opened that book and turned on my oven, I wasn't ready to face it yet. That night, I tried to maintain my normal routine. I made dinner, watched television, answered emails from work. But every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the kitchen drawer. I could feel the book inside it, patient and waiting, like a cat preparing to pounce. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker. Not all the lights, just the ones in the kitchen. They pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. I sat frozen on the couch, watching the light dance across the walls, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The oven clicked on. I knew without looking that it would be set to 375 degrees. I knew without opening the drawer that the recipe book would be lying open to that same page, the purple ribbon marking the spot where grandmother's impossible message waited for me to understand. The humming started again, soft and low, drifting from the kitchen like smoke. This time, I recognized the song completely, a lullaby grandmother used to sing when I spent summers at her house, the one she hummed while teaching me to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, to knead bread until it felt like silk under my fingers. I found myself moving toward the kitchen without consciously deciding to do so. My feet carried me across the cold floor, past the flickering lights, to the drawer that now stood completely open. The recipe book lay inside, but it was no longer open to the cornbread recipe. Instead, it showed a page I'd looked at hundreds of times, grandmother's famous chicken and dumplings, the recipe that had fed 3 generations of our family. But now, in the margins around the familiar ingredients and instructions, new words had appeared in that same faint pencil. "They won't let me see you, but I can still reach you here. In the kitchen, where we learned together. In the recipes that carry my hands, my voice, my love. I'm not sick, child. I'm not confused. I see things they don't want me to see, remember things they need me to forget. They think distance will make me quiet, make me fade. They're wrong." My vision blurred, and for a moment I could swear I saw her. Not clearly, not completely, but a suggestion of her presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven's heat. The smell of her perfume, faint but unmistakable, mingled with the phantom scent of cornbread. I reached for the book, but as my fingers touched the page, the writing began to fade. The pencil marks grew lighter and lighter until they disappeared completely, leaving only the original recipe in grandmother's careful script. The light stopped flickering. The oven went silent. The humming faded until all I could hear was the distant sound of traffic and my own ragged breathing. I stood in my kitchen, alone and shaking, staring at a recipe book that looked completely ordinary in the harsh fluorescent light. No mysterious messages, no ghostly annotations, no proof that anything supernatural had occurred. Just an old book filled with old recipes, the kind of thing a grieving grandson might imagine held magical properties in his desperation to maintain a connection with someone he'd lost. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd read. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the nocturnal visits became a routine. Always the same pattern, the flickering lights, the oven warming to exactly 375 degrees, the recipe book appearing in different locations throughout my apartment, despite being locked away. Each time new messages appeared in the margins of familiar recipes, always in grandmother's handwriting, always telling me things that made less and less sense as the days passed. She wrote about doctors who weren't really doctors, about medication that was meant to make her forget, about a place that wasn't really a care facility but something else entirely. She wrote about other elderly people who had been taken from their families under similar circumstances, all of them too sharp, too aware, too dangerous to be left alone with their memories. The messages grew more urgent, more desperate. She begged me to find her, to look for a place that didn't officially exist, to trust no one in the family because they had been convinced or coerced or threatened into compliance. She told me the recipe book was our only connection, that as long as I kept it and read it and cooked from it, they couldn't completely erase her. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. I wanted to think that grief and isolation and too much caffeine were creating elaborate hallucinations, that my subconscious mind was inventing supernatural explanations for a situation that was simply sad and ordinary. An old woman with dementia, a family making difficult but necessary decisions, a grandson struggling to accept a loss he couldn't prevent or understand. But the details were too specific, too consistent, too unlike anything my conscious mind would have invented. And sometimes, when the messages appeared, I could feel her presence so strongly it was like she was standing right beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice in my ear. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that none of this was real. The other part, the part that had spent countless hours in her kitchen, learning not just how to cook but how to love through food, how to preserve tradition and memory and flour and butter and patience, that part knew better. Something was happening that couldn't be explained by psychology or grief or stress-induced hallucinations. Something that involved my grandmother, my family, and a conspiracy of silence that went deeper than simple embarrassment or misguided kindness. The question wasn't whether I believed the messages were real. The question was what I was going to do about it. Tonight, as I write this, the lights have begun to flicker again. The oven is warming to 375 degrees, and I can smell cornbread baking in an empty kitchen. The recipe book lies open on my table, and I can see new words appearing in the margins, letter by careful letter, as if written by an invisible hand. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or discovering a truth too strange to be believed, but I know I'm going to find out. Story 9. In the floorboards in the hallway had always been uneven, but I'd never noticed how they seemed to dip toward the closet door until the night I heard it breathe. I'd been renting the Richmond house for 8 months, drawn by the vintage charm and the landlord's casual mention that the previous tenant had left abruptly. The closet under the stairs came with a heavy brass lock, tarnished black around the edges. When I'd asked about the key, the landlord had shrugged and said he'd never had one. Some things were better left alone, he'd added with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. That first week, I'd tried picking the lock out of curiosity, but the mechanism felt seized, as if rust had welded its parts together. I'd pressed my ear to the door once, hearing only the hollow echo you'd expect from an empty space. The wood was solid oak, thick enough that my knuckles barely made a sound when I rapped against it. Eventually, I forgot about it entirely, using the space in front of the door to stack boxes of books I never seemed to find time to unpack. The night everything changed. I'd been up until nearly 2, grading papers and surviving on instant coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. My stomach growled with the hollow ache of someone who'd forgotten to eat dinner, so I padded to the kitchen in sock feet, hoping to find something that didn't require actual cooking. The hardwood felt different under my feet as I passed the closet, colder, somehow, as if the wood itself had drawn the warmth from my soles. I paused, one hand on the kitchen doorframe, and looked back. The stack of book boxes sat exactly where I'd left them, casting angular shadows in the dim hallway light. That's when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration that seemed to rise from deep within the house's bones, like an engine idling in the basement, or the way your chest feels when you stand too close to a subwoofer. It pulsed once, twice, then settled into a low, continuous rumble that I felt more than heard. I stood there for what might have been seconds or minutes, my hand gripping the doorframe until my knuckles went white. The sound, if it was a sound, seemed to be coming from behind the closet door, but not from inside the closet itself, from something behind the door, something that occupied the same space but existed in a dimension slightly to the left of reality. The rumble stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I could hear the house settling, the way old houses do at night, with small creaks and sighs that usually comforted me. But underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else breathing too. The door handle moved. Not dramatically, not like in the movies where doorknobs turn slowly while violins screech, just a slight tremor, as if someone on the other side had bumped against the door while trying to find a comfortable position. The brass caught what little light filtered down from upstairs, winking once before going still. Then it happened again. This time I was sure. The handle had definitely moved, just a tiny rotation clockwise before snapping back. I found myself walking toward it, my feet carrying me forward, despite every rational thought screaming at me to turn around and go to bed. The books I'd stacked against the door had shifted slightly, their neat pile now leaning at an odd angle. I reached out to straighten them, and the moment my fingers touched the cardboard, that rumbling started again. Not from behind the door this time, from inside the door itself, as if the wood had developed lungs and was breathing in my direction. I jerked my hand back and practically ran to my bedroom. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been the heating system. Old houses had old pipes, and pipes made strange noises. The door handle thing was probably the building settling, putting pressure on the frame in ways that affected the hardware. Perfectly rational explanations that lasted right up until I walked past the closet and saw that my books had been rearranged. Not dramatically rearranged, not scattered or thrown around. Simply moved with surgical precision, so that they formed a perfect square directly in front of the door, with gaps between each box exactly wide enough for someone to place their feet. I stared at that arrangement for a long time, trying to remember if I could have possibly done it myself in some kind of sleep-deprived fugue state. But I'd touched the books for maybe 2 seconds the night before, and I'd been fully awake, fully aware of everything around me. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought the strongest padlock they sold, along with a motion-activated security camera that promised to record everything to the cloud. If something was getting into that closet, if someone had a key I didn't know about, I was going to find out. The new lock slid home with a satisfying click, and I positioned the camera at the end of the hallway with a perfect view of the door. The app on my phone showed crystal clear footage of the empty corridor, the closet door standing solid and immutable at the far end. I moved the books back to their original random pile and went to bed feeling like I'd taken control of the situation. At 2:41 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. The timestamp showed 2:41:33 when the recording began. The hallway looked exactly the same as it had when I'd gone to sleep, except for one detail that made my blood feel thick and cold in my veins. At the bottom of the frame, I could see the very edges of 2 feet, not full feet. Just the curved lines of 2 shoe tips pointed toward the closet door. They were there for exactly 11 seconds, perfectly still, then simply weren't there anymore. No movement in or out of frame, no gradual exit. One moment the feet were there, the next they were gone. But the books had moved again. This time, they'd been arranged in a straight line leading from the camera to the door, like stepping stones across a stream. Each box was positioned with mathematical precision, the distances between them identical to the last millimeter. I watched the recording 17 times, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow or blur that might explain what I was seeing. The timestamp never jumped, the picture never flickered. At 2:41:33, motion was detected. At 2:41:44, the motion stopped. And somewhere in those 11 seconds, someone or something had rearranged 23 boxes of books without appearing on camera. The next night, I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the hallway. I'd moved an armchair specifically for this purpose, angled so I could see the closet door while remaining hidden in the shadows. I had coffee to keep me awake, my phone to monitor the camera feed, and a baseball bat that I told myself was just for peace of mind. Nothing happened until 2:41. The motion alert buzzed my phone at the exact same time I saw movement in the hallway. But what I saw didn't match what the camera recorded. On my phone screen, I watched the same thing as the night before. 11 seconds of empty hallway, with mysterious feet at the edge of the frame. But with my own eyes, I saw someone walking slowly toward the closet door. Not someone. Something. The figure moved with a strange liquid gait, as if its joints bent in directions that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. It cast no shadow on the walls, reflected no light from its skin or clothing. When it reached the closet door, it stopped and turned its head toward my hiding spot. I couldn't see its face. The darkness was too complete, but I felt its gaze like a weight on my chest. We stared at each other across the length of the house, this impossible visitor and I, until the motion alert stopped buzzing and the figure simply melted back into the shadows it had emerged from. My books had been arranged in a perfect circle around the door. I didn't sleep for the next 3 days. On the 4th night, exhaustion finally claimed me, and I woke to find that something had been sliding objects under the closet door while I slept. My coffee mug from the kitchen counter, a book from my nightstand, my car keys from the dining room table, all of them arranged in a neat line against the door's base, as if waiting for me to collect them. When I moved them back to their proper places, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the house, about reality, about my own sanity. Each object bore scratches. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks carved with something sharp enough to score ceramic and metal alike. Parallel lines that ran from bottom to top, exactly the width of human fingernails. The marks were fresh. I could still see tiny particles of material where the scratching tool had bitten deep. But the most unsettling detail wasn't the scratches themselves. It was their placement. Each set of marks was positioned exactly where my fingers would naturally rest if I picked up the object. As if something had been studying how I held my coffee cup, how I gripped my keys, mapping the pressure points of my daily routines with obsessive precision. I started keeping everything in my bedroom after that, but it didn't matter. Whatever lived behind that closet door seemed to have an unlimited reach throughout the house. I'd wake to find scratched items that I was certain I'd left safely locked away. My toothbrush, my reading glasses, the pen I'd used to grade papers the night before, always the same parallel scratches, always positioned where my fingers would naturally fall. The motion detector continued its nightly recordings, showing the same impossible 11 seconds of empty hallway, with feet that shouldn't exist. But I stopped watching after the 7th night, when I realized the feet were getting clearer. Not closer to the camera, but more solid somehow, as if whatever cast them was slowly becoming more real. Instead, I focused on the scratches, trying to understand their pattern. I measured them obsessively, photographed them from every angle, compared them to nail marks I made on scrap wood. The spacing was perfectly consistent. 4 parallel lines, each separated by exactly 2 millimeters. The depth varied depending on the material, but the pressure pattern was always the same. Deepest at the bottom, fading gradually toward the top. Human fingernails, but not quite. The angle was wrong, the curve too sharp, like someone had taken the basic structure of a human hand and stretched it, extended it, made it into something that could reach farther and grip tighter than any natural appendage should. 3 weeks after it all began, I found myself standing in front of the closet door at 2:40 a.m., waiting. I'd stopped trying to sleep, stopped pretending that any of this could be explained by rational means. The motion detector hung silent on the wall, its red LED blinking steadily in the darkness. 1 minute until the nightly visitation. I reached out and placed my palm flat against the door's wooden surface. The wood was ice cold, as if winter lived permanently on the other side. I could feel the grain beneath my fingers, the subtle imperfections that proved this was real, solid, normal oak planking. 30 seconds. A vibration started under my palm, so faint I might have imagined it. Like a cat's purr, but deeper, more resonant. The kind of sound you feel in your bones rather than hear with your ears. 10 seconds. The vibration intensified, and I realized it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a pattern that seemed almost familiar. Like a heartbeat, but slower, more deliberate. Like breathing, but from lungs far larger than any human chest could contain. 2:41 a.m. My phone buzzed with the motion alert, but I didn't look down. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, my palm pressed against wood that was growing warmer by the second. The vibration became a sound, the sound became a voice, and the voice spoke a single word that I felt more than heard. Soon, the warmth under my palm suddenly turned scorching, and I jerked my hand away to find 4 parallel scratches burned into my skin. Not cuts, burns, as if something impossibly hot had raked across my flesh. The marks were positioned exactly where I naturally curved my fingers, matching the pattern I'd found on every object that had passed through that door. I looked at my scratched palm, then at the closet door, then at my phone still buzzing with its motion alert. On the screen, I could see the familiar sight of empty hallway and mysterious feet. But this time there was something new. This time, I could see my own figure standing directly in front of the door, my palm pressed against the wood, my body clearly visible in the camera's digital eye. But according to the app's timestamp, the motion had been detected 30 seconds before I'd approached the door. I'm writing this now as morning light filters through the windows, trying to make sense of what's happening to me, to this house, to the very fabric of reality in the space around that closet door. The scratches on my palm have healed already, too quickly, impossibly quickly, but I can still feel them burning when I flex my fingers. The motion detector recorded its usual 11 seconds last night, but when I checked the footage this morning, I found something that shouldn't exist. In the final frame, just before the recording stops, there's a shadow on the wall that doesn't match anything in the hallway. A shadow of a figure much taller than me, with arms that stretch far longer than human proportions should allow. The shadow is reaching toward the camera. Tonight, I'm going to unlock the door. I know it's not rational. I know it goes against every survival instinct I possess, but the scratches on my palm are spreading, not wider, but deeper, as if something is slowly carving its way through the layers of my skin from the inside out. And I'm starting to understand that whatever lives behind that door isn't trying to get out. It's trying to bring me in. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether I'm losing my mind. It's whether the mind I'm losing was ever really mine to begin with, or if it's been slowly transferring to whatever waits in the space between spaces, in the place that exists behind a door that was never meant to be locked. Tomorrow, I'll know for certain, unless tomorrow never comes. Story 10. The first thing I noticed about apartment 4B wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the decades-old carpet that smelled faintly of cigarettes and desperation. It wasn't even the way the floorboards groaned under my feet like old bones settling into a grave. It was the silence, a thick, expectant quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums, waiting for something I couldn't name. The building manager, a squat woman with nicotine-stained fingers and suspicious eyes, had been unusually forthcoming about the previous tenant. Vanished overnight, she'd said, jangling her keys with unnecessary force. Left everything behind, Clothes, furniture, even her cat. Poor thing was half-starved when we found it 3 days later. She'd paused then, studying my face for some reaction I didn't give her. Rent's been reduced accordingly. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why a woman would abandon her entire life without a trace. Why the rent was so cheap for downtown Buffalo. Why the manager's hands shook when she handed me the keys. Instead, I saw the exposed brick walls, the high ceilings, the way the afternoon light slanted through the large windows, and signed the lease that same day. The apartment felt different at night. During daylight hours, it was merely old. Creaky pipes, temperamental radiator, the occasional flutter of loose wallpaper when the ancient heating system wheezed to life. But after sunset, something shifted. The shadows pooled in corners that seemed too deep, and the sounds from neighboring apartments took on an underwater quality, as if filtered through layers of dense material I couldn't identify. I worked night shifts at the medical center, 12-hour stretches that left me exhausted and hollow-eyed. Coming home at dawn became a ritual of careful footsteps and held breath, as though I were intruding on something that belonged to the darkness. I'd collapse into bed around 7 in the morning, pull blackout curtains tight against the climbing sun, and sleep until early afternoon. It was during one of these deep, post-shift sleeps that I first heard it. A whisper, barely audible, pressed close to my left ear. Not words exactly, but a sound with the cadence of speech, urgent and intimate. I jerked awake, heart hammering, and found myself staring at the empty bedroom. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. I'd been asleep for less than 8 hours, but every instinct screamed that something had woken me, something that didn't belong. I lay there for 20 minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of an old building, the settling of wood, the distant hum of someone's television, the occasional car passing on the street below. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under, but the memory of that whisper clung to the edges of my consciousness like smoke. The second time it happened, I was ready for it. Same time, 3:23 a.m. by the clock, same proximity to my ear. This time I caught fragments. Warning, late, already gone. Or maybe I imagined the words, my sleep-fogged brain trying to make sense of meaningless sound. I sat up immediately, scanning the room, but found only familiar shadows and the faint outline of my furniture in the darkness. By the third occurrence, I'd begun timing it. Always between 3:00 and 3:30. Always when I was deepest in sleep. Always with that same urgent warning quality that made my skin crawl even as I struggled to understand what was being said. I mentioned it to one of the nurses at work, trying to keep my voice casual. Old buildings, she'd said with a shrug. Sound carries in weird ways. Probably someone's television bleeding through the walls. But I knew the difference between the muffled sound of neighboring electronics and this intimate proximity, this feeling of breath against my ear. The kitchen incident happened 3 weeks after I'd moved in. I was making coffee before my shift, moving through the familiar routine of grinding beans and measuring water, when something made me look up. The dome light fixture above the small dining table was hanging at an odd angle, suspended by what looked like a single screw. As I watched, it began to rotate slowly, a lazy clockwise motion that made no sense given the stillness of the air around it. I stood frozen, coffee forgotten, watching this impossible ballet. The fixture weighed at least 5 pounds, old brass and frosted glass that belonged to a different decade. There was no breeze, no vibration, no logical explanation for its movement. Yet it continued its slow revolution, casting shifting shadows across the walls like a broken lighthouse. I called the building manager the next day, describing the loose fixture as a safety hazard. She promised to send maintenance, but when I returned from work, the light hung straight and still. The maintenance request had been marked completed on my door, but there was no sign that anyone had been inside. All 4 screws were tight, the fixture stable. When I asked the manager about it later, she claimed no one had been sent. That was when the responses began. It started subtly, a soft echo from the wall when I closed a cabinet door too hard, a gentle knock-knock from somewhere inside the kitchen when I tapped my fingers on the counter. I dismissed it initially as the building's ancient infrastructure responding to vibration, pipes settling, wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But as days passed, the responses became more specific. A footstep in the hallway would be answered by a corresponding sound from within the walls. A dropped pen would prompt a similar tapping from somewhere behind the baseboard. It was as if the apartment itself had developed a sense of rhythm, a desire to participate in the small symphonies of daily life. The sensation of being watched intensified during this period. Not constantly, but in waves that would crash over me without warning. I'd be reading on the couch and suddenly feel the weight of observation pressing down from above, as though someone were peering through the ceiling. Or I'd be brushing my teeth and catch a sense of presence behind the bathroom mirror, just out of sight, but undeniably there. I bought security cameras, small wireless units that I installed in each room. The feeds showed nothing unusual during daylight hours, just me moving through my routine, occasionally pausing to look around with the expression of someone trying to remember what they'd forgotten. But the night footage was different. Not because it captured anything supernatural, but because of how I looked. The infrared showed me sitting up in bed multiple times, head cocked as if listening, sometimes for minutes at a time. I had no memory of these incidents. The whispers continued, always at the same witching hour, always with that same urgent quality. I began setting my phone to record, hoping to capture some evidence of what was happening. But the audio files contained nothing except my own breathing, the occasional shift of bedsheets, and once my own voice saying, "What?" in a tone of confused alertness. When the downstairs neighbors began their renovation project, everything changed. The sounds of construction, hammering, drilling, the scrape of furniture being moved, provided a new soundtrack to my days. But something else emerged from the chaos of renovation, a pattern of responses that made my blood turn cold. Every time I walked across the living room, a corresponding series of taps would echo from the wall that separated my apartment from the one below. Step tap, step tap tap, step tap. The rhythm was too precise to be coincidence, too immediate to be anything but reactive. I tested it obsessively, walking back and forth across the room at different speeds, in different patterns. The responses followed faithfully, as if someone were shadowing my movements from inside the wall structure itself. When I stopped abruptly, the tapping would cease. When I resumed walking, it would begin again, exactly matching my pace. The construction crew worked during normal business hours, but the responses continued even when the building was quiet, even at night when I was certain the workers had gone home. It was during one of these late-night sessions of involuntary call and response that I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The tapping wasn't coming from below anymore. It was coming from inside my own walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, following the sounds as they moved through the apartment's structure. The pattern was complex now, no longer simply echoing my footsteps but creating its own rhythm, its own logic. It was as if something were traveling through the spaces between the walls, mapping the interior of the building through sound. That night, the whispers were different. Instead of the usual urgent warning, I heard something that sounded like directions. This way, follow, here, now, move. My eyes snapped open to find myself sitting on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, as if I'd been preparing to stand. The clock read 3:28 a.m. I tried sage first, then incense, burning it in every room while reciting prayers I half remembered from childhood. The apartment filled with fragrant smoke, and for a few hours, the building felt quieter. The responses stopped. The sense of being watched lifted. I allowed myself to hope. But by the next evening, I realized the cleansing had only relocated the activity. The sounds now came from the bathroom instead of the kitchen, the bedroom instead of the living room. Whatever was happening had simply moved, retreating to areas I hadn't purified, regrouping like water finding new channels. More disturbing was the sense that the activity was now guiding me, drawing me toward specific areas of the apartment. The responses would cluster near the sliding door that led to the small balcony, a series of gentle taps that seemed almost inviting. When I ignored them, they would intensify, becoming more insistent, more urgent. I began spending more time on the balcony, telling myself it was for the fresh air, the view of the city below. But truthfully, it was because the sounds seemed to want me there. standing at the railing, looking down at the street 4 stories below. I felt a strange sense of completion, as if I were finally where I belonged. It was during one of these balcony sessions that I noticed the blinds. The apartment had vertical blinds on all the windows, standard issue beige plastic that I'd never bothered to replace. But the blinds on the sliding door had begun moving at odd times, subtle shifts that I initially attributed to air currents from the heating system, except the movement only occurred when I was considering leaving the apartment. The first time I noticed the correlation, I was getting dressed for work and mentally debating whether to look for a new place. The blinds gave a soft rustle, just once, as if responding to my thoughts. I paused, watching them, but they remained still. The second time was more dramatic. I'd been on the phone with a rental agency, inquiring about available apartments, when the blinds began swaying gently despite the complete absence of any breeze. The movement continued for the duration of the call, stopping abruptly when I hung up and decided to postpone the apartment search. By now, I was sleeping poorly, even during my designated rest hours. The night shift work had already disrupted my circadian rhythms, but this was different. A bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. I found myself making mistakes at work, losing track of conversations mid-sentence, staring at familiar equipment as if seeing it for the first time. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard, older somehow, with dark circles under my eyes, and a hollow quality to my cheeks that spoke of more than just physical fatigue. Sometimes, standing at the sink in the early morning light, I would catch myself listening for something. The whispers, the tapping, any sound that would confirm I wasn't losing my grip on reality. The building manager began avoiding me. When I passed her in the lobby, she would busy herself with paperwork, or suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The few times I managed to corner her with questions about the previous tenant, about the building's history, about whether other residents had reported unusual sounds, she would give vague, evasive answers before hurrying away. I tried researching the building's history online, searching through city records and newspaper archives. The structure was nearly a century old, had housed dozens of families over the decades. I found mentions of renovations, changes in ownership, the usual bureaucratic paperwork that accumulates around urban buildings. But nothing about disappearances, nothing about unexplained phenomena, nothing that would explain what was happening to me. Late one night, as I sat on the balcony listening to the distant sounds of traffic and trying to ignore the soft tapping from inside the apartment, I began to consider the possibility that the problem wasn't the building at all. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Stress could manifest in physical symptoms, phantom sounds, false memories, paranoid thinking. I'd seen it in patients during my medical training, the way exhaustion and anxiety could distort perception until the imaginary became indistinguishable from reality. But even as I tried to rationalize the experiences, my body knew better. The whispers had weight, substance, the particular quality that distinguishes real sound from imagined. The tapping had rhythm and intention that my subconscious mind couldn't have manufactured. And there were the small physical details, the loose light fixture, the moving blinds, things that existed independently of my perception. Unless they didn't. Unless my sleep-deprived brain was filling in gaps, creating a narrative that made sense of random stimuli. Unless I was slowly losing my ability to distinguish between what was happening around me and what was happening inside my own head. The thought should have been comforting, madness as an explanation for the inexplicable. Instead, it filled me with a terror more profound than any supernatural haunting. At least ghosts were external, something that could potentially be escaped or defeated. But if the source of the horror was my own mind, then there was nowhere to run. I began documenting everything obsessively. Times, sounds, locations, my physical and mental state during each incident. The journal entries started rational and detailed, but gradually became more erratic, filled with diagrams of sound patterns and theories about the building's acoustic properties that made sense only in the moment of writing them. Reading back through my own words, I could see the deterioration happening in real time, the handwriting becoming less controlled, the observations more paranoid, the conclusions more detached from logical possibility. I was watching myself unravel on paper, creating a written record of descent into something I couldn't name. The whispers now came multiple times per night, no longer confined to the 3 a.m. hour. Sometimes they seemed to be having conversations among themselves, overlapping voices that rose and fell like a distant cocktail party heard through thick walls. Other times they were clearly directed at me, urgent warnings or instructions that I could almost but never quite understand. I stopped trying to record them. The audio files had become meaningless, containing hours of silence punctuated only by my own increasingly frequent vocalizations. Questions asked to empty air, responses to conversations only I could hear. The tapping had evolved as well, becoming more complex, more musical. It would follow me through the apartment now, a percussion section that accompanied my daily routine. When I showered, soft rhythms would emanate from the pipes. When I cooked, the sounds would dance around the kitchen cabinets. When I tried to read, they would tap out patterns that matched the cadence of the text. Standing on the balcony became my only refuge, the one place where the sounds seemed muted, where the sensation of being watched diminished to a manageable level. I spent longer and longer periods there, sometimes entire afternoons when I should have been sleeping, watching the city spread out below and trying to remember what normal felt like. It was during one of these extended balcony sessions that I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my rational worldview. Looking down at the street, I noticed a woman standing on the sidewalk directly below my building. She was motionless, head tilted up, seemingly staring at my exact location. Even from 4 stories up, there was something familiar about her posture, something that made my chest tighten with recognition I couldn't place. I watched her for 20 minutes. She never moved, never looked away, never acknowledged the pedestrians who occasionally passed by. When I finally went inside to get binoculars, she was gone. But in the apartment behind me, the whispers had started again, and for the first time in weeks, I could understand them perfectly. "She's still here," they said, clear as daylight. "She never left. She's waiting." I spun around, expecting to find someone in the room with me, but saw only familiar furniture and afternoon shadows. The voice had been female, calm and matter-of-fact, carrying none of the urgent warning quality of the previous whispers. It had sounded like someone simply stating an obvious truth. When I looked back at the street, the woman was there again, in exactly the same position. This time she raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been a warning, before dissolving into the crowd of pedestrians like sugar into water. I called in sick to work that night, unable to face the pretense of normalcy required by professional interaction. Instead, I sat in my apartment, journal open, trying to document what was happening while some part of my mind still functioned rationally. But as I wrote, the handwriting began changing mid-sentence, becoming more feminine, more familiar. The words that appeared on the page were not ones I remembered forming. The whispers aren't warnings, they're invitations. The tapping isn't random, it's a map. The balcony isn't a refuge, it's a destination. And I'm not going crazy. I'm just finally listening to what's been trying to tell me the truth all along. She didn't disappear. She's still here, in the spaces between the walls, in the moments between sleeping and waking, in the breath between question and answer. And she's been waiting so patiently for someone who would understand, someone who would join her. I set down the pen with hands that trembled uncontrollably, staring at words I didn't remember writing and handwriting I didn't recognize. Outside, the blinds began their slow, hypnotic dance, responding to thoughts I was no longer sure were entirely my own. The whispers started again, gentle now, almost conversational, coming from everywhere and nowhere. And for the first time since moving into apartment 4B, I found myself walking toward them instead of away, drawn by a logic that made perfect sense in ways that had nothing to do with sanity. After all, someone had to answer when they called. Someone had to complete what she had started. Someone had to step out onto the balcony and finally understand what the voices had been trying to tell me all along. That the only thing more terrifying than losing your mind is the moment you realize you haven't lost it at all. That the whispers are real. That she's still here. That she's been waiting. And that some disappearances aren't escapes at all, but simply changes in perspective. shifts from one side of the wall to the other, transformations from the one who listens to the one who calls out in the dark, hoping the next tenant will be ready to hear the truth. The blinds are moving again. The balcony door is sliding open, and I finally understand why the rent was so cheap. Story 11. The thing about growing up on Millfield Road is that you never really leave it behind. Even now, 32 years old with a mortgage in Pittsburgh and a job that keeps me traveling, I can close my eyes and feel those familiar curves beneath my wheels, hear the gravel pop under tires on summer evenings, when the fireflies blink like scattered stars through the windshield. I hadn't been back in 3 years when Mom called about settling Dad's affairs. The old house sat empty now, weathered gray siding and sagging porch steps that nobody had bothered to fix. But it wasn't the house that drew me back down that secondary road at dusk. It was the need to prove something to myself, though I couldn't say exactly what. The cut-through stretched ahead, exactly as I remembered. A narrow ribbon of asphalt threading between hills that rose like sleeping giants on either side. Ancient maps labeled it simply as cut-through, and that's all anyone ever called it. No proper name, no historical markers, just a convenient shortcut between Route 18 and the county road that led to town. Nothing special about it, really. Nothing at all. The words had barely formed in my mind when my headlights flickered. I pressed the brake pedal, feeling the car slow on the empty road. The headlights steadied, throwing their usual twin cones of white light ahead. Must be the alternator, I told myself, making a mental note to have it checked when I got back to the city. The old Accord had been running rough lately anyway, but as I eased back onto the gas, the lights pulsed again. Not the weak flutter of a dying electrical system, but 3 distinct flashes. Deliberate, purposeful. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. There, about 50 yards ahead on the right shoulder, the massive oak that had fallen across the ditch sometime in my childhood still lay where it had landed. In daylight, it looked like what it was. A dead tree, bark peeling away in long strips, trunk slowly surrendering to rot and weather. In the darkness, with my headlights painting it in harsh white strokes, it resembled something else entirely. Something that might have been sleeping, or watching, or both. The radio crackled to life without warning, static bleeding through the speakers in waves. I reached for the knob to turn it off, but before my fingers found the dial, a voice emerged from the white noise, distant, as if calling from the bottom of a well. Nothing here. My hand froze halfway to the radio. The voice faded back into static, then silence as abruptly as it had begun. I sat there in the middle of the empty road, engine idling, heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to break free. No one had spoken those words. The radio had been off when I got in the car, the dial positioned between stations. But I had heard what I heard, clear as my own breathing in the confined space of the vehicle. I drove the rest of the way home without incident, but sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the old house settling, every whisper of wind through the eaves, seemed amplified in the darkness. I found myself listening for something specific, though I couldn't name what. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up the pretense of rest and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I heard the knocking. 3 taps, light and measured, against the front door. The same rhythm I remembered from childhood nights when fog rolled down from the hills and settled thick as cotton batting in the hollow where our house sat. Dad used to claim it was just the wood expanding and contracting, but Mom would get that tight look around her eyes and double-check the locks. I approached the door slowly, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. Through the peephole, I could see nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the porch railing. No car in the driveway, no figure standing on the steps, just emptiness stretching away into the night. The knocking came again, 1, 2, 3, and this time I was close enough to feel the vibration through the door itself. Someone was definitely out there, though the peephole showed nothing but shadows and the skeletal branches of the maple tree that overhung the front yard. I pressed my ear to the door and listened, holding my breath. From somewhere beyond the threshold came the sound of footsteps on gravel, moving away from the house with the same measured pace as the knocking. Then silence, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind me. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the porch stood empty. No footprints in the dust that had accumulated since Dad's last visit to the mailbox. No disturbance in the pattern of fallen leaves scattered across the wooden planks. If someone had been there, they'd left no trace of their presence. But the air felt different somehow. Charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every hair on your body stands at attention and you taste copper on your tongue. I spent the next day going through Dad's paperwork, trying to lose myself in the mundane details of estate settlement. Bills to pay, accounts to close, a dozen small administrative tasks that required nothing more than signatures and phone calls. Ordinary things that belonged to the daylight world, where explanations existed for every phenomenon, and insurance companies covered the damage. As evening approached, I felt the familiar pull of the cut-through. Not curiosity exactly, more like the compulsion you feel to probe a sore tooth with your tongue, knowing it will hurt, but unable to stop yourself. I told myself I was being rational. If I was going to sell the house, I needed to know about any electrical problems that might affect the property value. The flickering headlights from the night before could indicate a larger issue with the wiring. The sun was setting as I backed out of the driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of fire, or blood. I pushed the thought away and focused on the road ahead, the familiar sequence of turns that led from the county road to the cut-through. This time I was ready when the headlights began their strange dance. As I approached the fallen oak, they pulsed in that same deliberate pattern. 3 flashes, then steady light. I pulled over and put the car in park, leaving the engine running while I popped the hood to examine the battery connections. Everything looked normal. Clean terminals, tight connections, no obvious signs of corrosion or wear. I was reaching for the hood release when I heard it. A low whistle, barely audible above the idle of the engine. The kind of sound wind makes when it passes through a narrow gap, except there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy around me, thick with the scent of decaying leaves and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. The whistling grew louder, resolving into something that might have been a melody if you listened hard enough, or a voice, calling from a great distance. I stood there beside my car, straining to make sense of the sound, when the headlights flickered again. But this time they weren't alone. All along the cut-through, as far as I could see in either direction, points of light began to appear. Pinpricks at first, like stars reflecting in puddles, then growing brighter and more defined. They hung in the air about 3 feet off the ground, bobbing gently as if suspended by invisible strings. Some pulsed with the same rhythm as my headlights. Others flickered randomly, creating a complex pattern of illumination that seemed almost like communication or celebration. I counted at least 30 lights, maybe more, scattered along both sides of the road. They cast no glow on the surrounding trees or asphalt, somehow managing to be brilliant and contained at the same time. As I watched, transfixed, they began to move, not toward me, but in slow circles, like dancers performing some ancient ritual. The whistling had stopped. In fact, all sound had ceased. No engine noise from my still-running car, no rustle of leaves, no distant traffic from the highway. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick enough to absorb sound. One of the lights detached itself from the others and drifted toward me. As it drew closer, I could see it wasn't really light at all, but something that existed in the absence of darkness. A hole in the night that revealed something else underneath, something that didn't belong to this world, or any other I could name. It stopped about 10 feet away and hovered there, pulsing gently, waiting. I knew I should get back in the car and drive away. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place where the normal rules seemed not to apply, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Not curiosity this time, but a recognition that ran deeper than conscious thought. This was what had always been here, lurking just beyond perception. The presence I'd felt watching from the shadows during my childhood walks to the mailbox. The source of those careful footsteps on gravel and the deliberate knocking that came with the fog. The listener that had always been there, waiting for someone to acknowledge its existence by claiming it didn't exist. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, And in that illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The fallen oak wasn't a tree at all. It never had been. In the strange non-light cast by the hovering presence, I could see it clearly. The long, serpentine curve of a spine, the delicate architecture of ribs, the massive skull with empty sockets that had been watching the road for decades. And it wasn't the only one. All along the cut-through, half buried in the undergrowth and partially concealed by moss and creeping vines, bones jutted from the earth like accusations, femurs thick as fence posts, vertebrae the size of dinner plates, skulls that belonged to no earthly creature, with eye sockets positioned in configurations that hurt to look at directly. The lights weren't celebrating, they were marking graves. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak, and caught myself against the side of my car. The metal felt warm under my palm, almost feverish, and when I looked down, I saw that my headlights had gone dark. The engine had stopped running, though I hadn't turned the key. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and something else, a sound like breathing, deep and slow, coming from the ground beneath my feet. The floating light drifted closer, and in its glow, I saw the truth written in the very bones of the earth. This had never been just a cut-through. It was a scar, a wound in the world that had never properly healed. And like all wounds, it attracted certain kinds of attention. I don't remember getting back in the car or starting the engine. The next clear memory I have is sitting in my kitchen at dawn, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. My clothes were covered with dried mud and leaves, as if I'd been crawling through the underbrush, though I had no recollection of leaving the road. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress from Dad's death, too little sleep, maybe a minor psychological break brought on by returning to a place heavy with childhood memories. All perfectly reasonable theories that explained nothing and everything simultaneously. But when I looked out the kitchen window toward the cut-through, I could see them even in the pale morning light. Little disturbances in the air above the road, like heat shimmer on hot asphalt. Waiting, I packed my bags and drove back to Pittsburgh that afternoon, taking the highway instead of the cut-through. But I can still feel them sometimes, especially on foggy nights when the world seems thin and permeable. They're still there, still listening, still marking their territory with lights that exist in the spaces between what is and what might be. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment and the silence grows too heavy, I catch myself thinking about that road, about the whispered voice on the radio, and the careful knocking, and the patient watchers who guard their secrets in plain sight. I think about saying it, those three simple words that serve as both denial and invitation. But I don't. Because now I know. The cut-through listens, and it remembers everything. Story 12. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. Pipes expanding, floorboards contracting, the skeleton of decades breathing in ways that unsettle the living. But houses don't launch silverware across rooms with surgical precision. I had inherited Uncle Theodore's cutlery set 3 months prior, along with his mahogany display cabinet and a collection of debts I was still sorting through. The silver-plated pieces sat behind glass doors like sleeping artifacts, 12 place settings of ornate spoons, forks, and knives that had never known a proper dinner party. Theodore had been particular about his possessions, obsessive even, cataloging every piece with the fervor of a museum curator. I kept meaning to sell the set, but something about disturbing his meticulous arrangement felt wrong, like opening a grave. The afternoon it began, October light filtered through my living room windows in thin, watery streams. I was reviewing legal documents in the kitchen when the sound reached me. A metallic vibration, almost musical, followed by the sharp crack of metal striking hardwood. The noise pulled me from my papers like a fishhook. In the living room, a dessert spoon lay 2 meters from the cabinet, its bowl facing the ceiling like a small silver moon. The glass doors remained closed, their brass latches secure. I examined the spoon, turning it over in my hands. The metal felt cold, colder than the ambient temperature should have allowed. No scratches, no dents, nothing to indicate it had fallen or been thrown. I returned the spoon to its designated slot, checking the cabinet's stability. Solid as a monument. The house had been empty except for me, windows closed against the October chill. No seismic activity that might explain the movement. I filed the incident away as one of those inexplicable moments that punctuate ordinary life, the kind you mention to friends as a curiosity and then forget, but the spoon remembered. 3 hours later, my brother called. His voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since we were children afraid of basement shadows. He explained that our mother's phone had gone dead mid-conversation, cutting off her words about weekend plans with the finality of a blade. When he tried calling back, nothing. Straight to a silence that felt deliberate. He had driven to her house, finding her car in the driveway, but no response to his knocking. The windows remained dark, curtains drawn, like closed eyes. The next morning, she called as if nothing had occurred, her voice bright with confusion when he mentioned his concern. She insisted her phone had worked perfectly, that she had spoken to no one the previous evening. The device showed no record of their conversation, no missed calls, no technical failures that might explain the communication void. I thought of the spoon, lying there with its bowl turned skyward, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. 2 weeks passed before it happened again. This time a salad fork materialized near the hallway entrance, its tines gleaming like tiny silver daggers. The timing coincided with my sister's sudden radio silence. 3 days without responding to messages or calls before she resurfaced, cheerful and unaware of any interruption in our communication. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each incident with scientific precision. Date, time, which piece moved, its exact location, distance from the cabinet, orientation. Always the eating surface faced up, spoon bowls, fork tines, the cutting edge of knives, always positioned as if waiting to be used by invisible diners. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Each piece landed at a specific distance corresponding to the duration of lost contact with family members. Short silences yielded movements of mere feet. Longer communication gaps resulted in pieces appearing in distant rooms. The mathematics felt intentional, as if the cutlery operated according to rules I was only beginning to understand. More disturbing was the directionality. When I mapped the positions on paper, every piece pointed toward the front door with compass precision. Not randomly scattered, but arranged like arrows indicating a single destination. The pattern suggested something was drawing them, or being drawn by them, toward the threshold between my home and the world beyond. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, listening for the telltale vibration that preceded each movement. The sound had subtle variations. Different pieces produced different tones, as if each possessed its own voice. The dessert spoons sang highest, their smaller bowls creating crystalline notes. The soup spoons offered deeper resonances, like distant bells. The knives remained silent until impact, their arrival announced only by the sharp finality of steel meeting wood. During daylight hours, I maintained the pretense of normalcy. I continued my work, handled Theodore's remaining affairs, responded to emails with appropriate enthusiasm. But evening brought vigilance. My attention split between ordinary tasks and the cabinet's glass-fronted silence. I installed small bells on the doors, thinking to catch the pieces in motion, but they never rang. Whatever force moved the cutlery bypassed such crude detection methods. The most unsettling realization came during the 4th week of incidents. I had been charting not just the physical positions, but the timing patterns, looking for correlations between cutlery movement and family communication failures. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I understood about causation. The silverware didn't react to communication problems, it predicted them. Each piece moved approximately 6 hours before the corresponding family member would become unreachable. The dessert spoon had appeared that Tuesday afternoon, and by evening my mother's phone calls went unanswered. The salad fork materialized Wednesday morning. By dinner time, my sister had vanished into one of her inexplicable silent periods. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be imagined. I began testing the theory, watching for movements, and then attempting contact with various family members. The correlation held with disturbing accuracy. When a butter knife appeared near the bathroom door, I immediately called my cousin, straight to voicemail, her number temporarily disconnected due to a billing error she wouldn't discover until the following day. The cutlery was somehow aware of future communication failures, responding to events that hadn't yet occurred. This violated every rational understanding of causality I possessed, suggesting either supernatural intervention or a complete breakdown of my ability to process reality accurately. The notebook filled with observations, measurements, desperate attempts to find logical explanations. I researched electromagnetic interference, subsonic vibrations, anything that might cause both cutlery displacement and communication equipment failure. The scientific approach provided comfort, even when it yielded no answers. Documentation felt like control, as if recording the impossible might somehow contain it. But documentation also revealed the escalating nature of the phenomenon. The pieces were moving further from the cabinet, their journeys growing more ambitious with each incident. What began as movements measured in feet had progressed to pieces appearing in distant rooms, always maintaining their directional orientation toward the front door. The implications terrified me. If the pattern continued, eventually a piece would reach the door itself. What would happen then? Would the cutlery attempt to leave the house? And if so, what would that mean for the family members whose communication failures it predicted? I considered removing the entire set, donating it or selling it to break whatever connection existed between the silver and my family's well-being. But something stopped me each time I approached the cabinet with that intention. A feeling, wordless but insistent, that disturbing the arrangement would bring consequences worse than enduring the current situation. The pieces seemed to sense my consideration. They began moving more frequently, as if responding to my thoughts of separation. 3 times in 1 week I found cutlery displaced, each piece positioned closer to the front door than the last. The pattern was accelerating, building towards something I couldn't predict but increasingly feared. Late one Thursday evening, while reviewing my notes by lamplight, I heard the familiar metallic vibration, but this time, it came from multiple sources simultaneously, a discordant symphony of silver voices rising from the cabinet. I rushed to the living room, my notebook clutched like a shield against whatever I might find. The cabinet doors stood open. Inside, every remaining piece trembled against its velvet backdrop, creating a sustained harmonic resonance that filled the room with impossible music. The vibration grew stronger, the pieces blurring with motion while somehow remaining in their designated positions. The sound built to a crescendo that seemed to penetrate not just my ears but my bones, my teeth, the very substance of my being. Then silence. When my vision cleared, I found myself staring at an empty cabinet. Every piece of cutlery had vanished, leaving only indentations in the velvet where they had rested for decades. The display case looked like a mouth with all its teeth extracted, shocking in its completeness. I searched the house frantically, expecting to find the pieces scattered like breadcrumbs leading to the front door. But there was nothing. No silver gleaming from corners, no metallic reflections catching lamplight, no physical evidence that the cutlery had ever existed. The silence felt different now. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of potential sound. The house had lost something essential, some quality I hadn't realized was present until it disappeared. The air itself seemed thinner, as if the cutlery's departure had taken with it some fundamental property of the space I inhabited. I called my family members, all of them, breaking social conventions about appropriate calling hours. Everyone answered immediately, their voices clear and present, no technical difficulties or communication failures. For the first time in months, I could reach anyone I wanted, whenever I wanted, but the relief felt hollow, tinged with a growing certainty that something was wrong with this sudden perfection. Communication worked too well, connections formed too easily, as if the barriers that normally separated people had been artificially removed. Standing in the empty living room, notebook clutched in trembling hands, I understood with terrible clarity what had occurred. The cutlery hadn't been predicting communication failures, it had been preventing something worse. Each displaced piece had served as a kind of pressure valve, releasing some accumulating force before it could reach critical mass. Now, with no pieces left to serve as early warning systems, no silver sentinels to monitor the invisible currents connecting my family to whatever lay beyond the front door, we existed in a state of perfect, unprotected contact. I approached the window facing the street, pressing my palm against the cold glass. Outside, the neighborhood appeared normal. Porch lights glowing warmly, cars parked in driveways, the comfortable geometry of suburban life. But something felt different about the darkness between streetlights, the spaces where illumination couldn't reach. And in that darkness, barely visible against the night sky, I could swear I saw the gleam of silver moving purposefully through the shadows, heading away from my house toward destinations I couldn't imagine, but somehow knew I didn't want to discover. The notebook slipped from my fingers, pages fluttering to the floor like injured birds. In the spreading silence, I wondered if losing the ability to communicate with my family would have been a mercy compared to what perfect contact might ultimately cost. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond my windows, 12 place settings of inherited silver moved with deliberate purpose, carrying with them the protective barriers that had stood between my family and something that had been waiting, with infinite patience, for exactly this moment of unguarded connection. The front door stood closed, but I could no longer shake the feeling that closed was not the same as locked, and that whatever had been kept at bay by Uncle Theodore's meticulous arrangement was now free to test the strength of more fragile barriers. In the morning, I would discover that my family could not only be reached with unprecedented ease, but that they had begun reaching back, their calls and messages arriving with a frequency that felt less like communication and more like something else entirely. Something that wore the mask of connection while serving purposes I was only beginning to fear I might understand. Story 13. The ritual began with her suitcase clicking shut in the bedroom. Every time my partner left for those business trips, the same sequence would unfold. The kiss goodbye, the promise to call when she landed, and then the silence that filled our St. Paul apartment like water rushing into a sinking ship. But it wasn't the loneliness that bothered me. It was what came after dark. I developed habits during those solitary weeks. Both deadbolts would slide home with satisfying clicks, metal against metal, secure and final. The wooden chair from our kitchen table would find its new purpose wedged beneath the door handle, its back legs scraping against hardwood as I positioned it just right. These weren't the actions of a paranoid man, I told myself. They were the reasonable precautions of someone who understood that cities held dangers, especially for those who lived alone in converted warehouses where the walls were too thick and the neighbors too distant. The apartment building had character, the realtor had said. Built in 1924, she'd explained, back when they constructed things to last. The hallways stretched long and narrow, lined with doors that led to units carved from what had once been a single enormous space. Our door opened onto the main corridor, but there was another door in our bedroom, a peculiar feature that the previous tenant had requested, according to building management. It connected to a shorter hallway that dead-ended at a maintenance closet, accessible only through our unit or the super's master key. I'd always found that second door unsettling. It felt redundant, unnecessary, like an invitation for problems that didn't need to exist. But my partner liked the extra privacy it provided, the way it created a buffer between our bedroom and the building's main artery of foot traffic and muffled conversations. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday night in October, exactly 3 weeks after she'd left for her extended project in Denver. I'd been working late, hunched over my laptop in the living room, when the sound cut through the apartment's ambient hum with startling clarity. 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced evenly apart. Each one resonated with the kind of weight that suggested knuckles against solid wood rather than the quick tap of fingertips. I froze, cursor blinking on my screen, ears straining against the sudden silence. Our building attracted its share of late-night wanderers, delivery drivers who'd gotten the address wrong, neighbors who'd had too much to drink and forgotten their floor number. But those visitors usually knocked with a rhythm that conveyed urgency or confusion. These knocks felt different, patient. as if whoever stood on the other side had all the time in the world. I waited. Minutes stretched by, marked only by the whisper of heating vents and the distant hum of traffic on Grand Avenue. When no follow-up came, no voice calling through the door, no retreating footsteps, I crept to the peephole and peered through the distorted lens. The hallway appeared empty, bathed in the building's perpetual amber glow. Perhaps I should have opened the door then. Perhaps a normal person would have called out, asked who was there. Instead, I returned to my laptop and tried to convince myself that the knocks had come from another unit, sound traveling in unexpected ways through the building's aging infrastructure. But an hour later, the pattern repeated itself. 3 knocks, identical in spacing and intensity, except this time they seemed to emanate from our bedroom, from the interior door that led nowhere anyone should be able to reach. My breath caught in my throat as I stood in the doorway between the living area and bedroom, staring at the door's painted surface. The knocks had definitely come from there. I could still feel their vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. But that hallway was supposed to be empty, accessible only through our unit or through the maintenance area that required special access. I grabbed my phone and opened the voice recorder, thumb hovering over the red button. If something unusual was happening, I wanted proof. Evidence that would make sense in the harsh light of morning, when shadows retreated and logical explanations could flourish. The third incident confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. As I stood there with my phone recording, the chair in the front room creaked. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone testing its weight before deciding whether to sit down. But I was standing 15 feet away from it, and there was no one else in the apartment. The recording captured it perfectly. When I played it back the next morning, the creak was unmistakable, punctuated by what sounded like the soft exhale of someone settling their weight against furniture. But more disturbing was what I heard in the background, a faint scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, like fingernails dragging across painted wood. That afternoon, I contacted building management. The superintendent, a woman in her 60s who'd worked there for decades, listened to my concerns with the patient expression of someone who'd fielded stranger complaints. She agreed to inspect the locks, running her fingers along the deadbolts and testing their mechanisms with professional thoroughness. "Everything's in perfect working order," she said, pocketing her tools. "These locks are top quality, installed just 2 years ago after we had some break-in attempts on the 3rd floor. If someone was getting in, they'd have to be pretty sophisticated about it." She paused at the interior door, examining its frame and handle. "This hallway's been sealed off for years. The only way in is through your unit or the maintenance room, and I'm the only one with keys to that. Sometimes pipes settle funny in these old buildings, make all kinds of noise." Her explanation made sense. I wanted it to be true. But that night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I turned off the lights. The key to the interior door, a brass key that we kept on the bedroom dresser, was lying on the carpet beside the bed, 30 centimeters from where it had been when I'd last seen it that morning. I picked it up slowly, feeling its weight in my palm. The carpet showed no sign of disturbance, no footprints or impressions that would suggest someone had entered the room. But the key's position was impossible to explain away as coincidence or misremembering. It was too far from the dresser to have simply fallen, and the angle was all wrong. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every night brought the same sequence: 3 knocks at the front door at exactly midnight, followed an hour later by identical knocks at the interior door. The chair would creak at some point during these episodes, always captured by my phone's recorder but never witnessed directly. And every morning, without exception, I would find the brass key displaced from its position on the dresser, always at the same distance and angle from where I'd left it. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying in bed during those crucial hours, every muscle tensed, waiting for the sounds that had become as predictable as a clock's ticking. The knocks never varied in their timing or intensity. They carried the same patient quality, as if the visitor understood that I was listening and approved of my attention. I began researching the building's history, diving into city records and old newspaper archives. What I found did nothing to ease my growing unease. The building had indeed been constructed in 1924, but its original purpose wasn't residential. It had served as a processing facility for a meat packing company, with the upper floors used for storage and the lower levels housing machinery that broke down livestock into component parts. The conversion to apartments had happened in the 1980s, but there had been problems. Several tenants had reported strange incidents, sounds in the walls, items moved during the night, the persistent feeling of being watched. 3 different families had broken their leases within the first year, citing incompatible living conditions without providing specific details. Most unsettling was a newspaper clipping from 1987, buried in the back pages of the local section. A tenant in Unit 4B, my unit, had called police to report a break-in, claiming that someone was entering his apartment nightly despite locked doors and functioning security measures. The responding officers found no signs of forced entry, and the case was ultimately dismissed as a mental health issue when the tenant began insisting that the intruder was someone who had died in the building decades earlier. I read that article 17 times, memorizing every detail. The tenant's description matched my own experiences with unsettling precision. The midnight knocks, the sounds from empty spaces, the feeling of a presence that couldn't be seen or directly confronted. The article didn't mention what had ultimately happened to that tenant, but a follow-up search showed that the lease for 4B had been terminated early, with the unit remaining vacant for several months afterward. My partner called regularly, her voice a lifeline to normalcy and rational thought. I considered telling her about the incidents, but found myself hesitating each time the conversation turned toward how I was handling the solitude. How do you explain to someone you love that you're being visited by something that might not exist? How do you convey the certainty you feel about impossible events? Instead, I focused on maintaining the illusion of normalcy. I described my work, the books I was reading, the restaurants where I'd been eating dinner. I asked about her project, the colleagues she was meeting, the city she was exploring. These conversations became anchors, reminding me that there was a world beyond our apartment where things followed predictable patterns and logical rules. But even during those calls, I found myself listening for sounds in the background, waiting for the familiar creak of the chair or the soft impact of knocks against wood. The visitor, it seemed, was growing more confident. The knocks came not just at midnight now, but at various hours throughout the night. Sometimes I would wake to find the brass key in different locations, beside the bathroom door, on the kitchen counter, once even sitting on the arm of the very chair that had been creaking. I installed a security camera in the living room, a small device that promised to capture anything unusual in high-definition clarity. The first night's footage showed nothing but empty rooms bathed in infrared light. But the audio track told a different story. The knocks were clearly audible, accompanied by what sounded like footsteps moving slowly across hardwood floors. Most disturbing was a segment where the camera's night vision picked up the chair moving slightly, its legs shifting position as if someone had brushed against it while passing. But there was never any figure in the frame, no shadow or disturbance that could account for the sounds and movements being recorded. I began to question my own perception of events. Was I perhaps sleepwalking, moving the key myself during unconscious episodes? Could the building's age and construction create acoustic illusions that my stressed mind was interpreting as deliberate patterns? The rational part of my brain offered these explanations, but they felt hollow against the weight of accumulating evidence. The recordings didn't lie. The consistent timing of the knocks, the precise displacement of the key, the way the chair moved in response to invisible contact. These weren't symptoms of delusion or misinterpretation. They were documentation of something that followed its own logic, something that had found a way to exist in the spaces between what was possible and what was happening. 3 weeks before my partner's scheduled return, the visits intensified. The knocks now came from multiple locations throughout the apartment. The front door, the interior door, sometimes even from inside the walls themselves, as if the visitor was moving through spaces that didn't technically exist. The recordings captured layers of sound, footsteps that seemed to pace the length of our hallway, the soft whisper of fabric brushing against surfaces, and underneath it all, a rhythmic scratching that suggested fingernails or claws marking territory. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, moving to the living room couch where I could keep watch over both doors simultaneously. But even there, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being observed, studied by something that had learned my routines and was planning its next move accordingly. The brass key continued its nightly migration, but now it was accompanied by other objects. I would wake to find books relocated to different shelves, kitchen utensils arranged in patterns I hadn't created, clothing moved from the bedroom to the living area. Each change was subtle enough that I could almost convince myself I'd forgotten making it. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. Someone or something was rearranging our life with deliberate intent. On the final night before my partner's return, I made a decision that I knew was probably foolish, but felt absolutely necessary. When the midnight knocks began, I didn't hide behind the couch with my recording equipment. Instead, I walked to the front door and pressed my ear against its surface, trying to hear what lay beyond the wood and metal that separated our space from the hallway. The knocking stopped immediately, as if my visitor had detected my proximity. For several minutes, we existed in a state of mutual awareness, separated by inches of material but somehow connected by the intensity of our focus on each other. I could feel a presence on the other side of the door, not threatening exactly, but persistent and patient and utterly alien to anything I'd experienced before. Then came the sound that made me step back from the door with my heart hammering against my ribs. Breathing, slow and steady, the rhythm of someone waiting calmly for a response they knew would eventually come. I wanted to speak, to demand identification or explanation, but some primitive instinct warned me that breaking the silence would change the nature of our interaction in ways I couldn't predict or control. Instead, I backed away from the door and returned to the couch, where I spent the remaining hours until dawn, listening to sounds that suggested my visitor was moving freely through spaces that should have been impossible to access. When morning came, I found the brass key sitting on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee I didn't remember making. The coffee was still warm, and next to it was a note written in handwriting I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. The message was simple: "Thank you for listening." I stared at those words for a long time, trying to understand their implication. Was this acknowledgement, appreciation, a farewell? The handwriting looked familiar in the way that dreams sometimes feel like memories, but I couldn't identify its source or recall when I might have seen it before. My partner returned that afternoon, filling the apartment with luggage and stories and the comfortable chaos of reunion. As she unpacked, chattering about her experiences and asking about mine, I found myself studying her movements with new attention. The way she arranged her belongings seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if she was following a pattern established during her absence. "You look tired," she observed, pausing in her unpacking to examine my face. "Have you been sleeping okay?" I started to tell her about the visits, the recordings, the impossible movements of objects throughout our home. But as I opened my mouth to begin the explanation, I noticed something that made the words die in my throat. There, on our bedroom dresser where it had always belonged, sat the brass key in its proper position, and beside it, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a small indentation in the wood surface, as if someone had been drumming their fingers against the dresser's edge while waiting patiently for something to begin. That night, as my partner slept soundly beside me, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of our building settling into darkness. But the knocks didn't come. The chair remained silent. For the first time in weeks, nothing moved except the gentle rise and fall of breathing from the person lying next to me. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I found myself missing the visitor's presence, the certainty that someone was paying attention even when I felt most alone. In the absence of those impossible sounds, our apartment felt empty in a way it never had before, as if something essential had been removed without my permission. As dawn approached, I realized that the question wasn't whether my experiences had been real or imagined. The question was whether the visitor had been waiting for my partner to return, or whether they had been waiting for me to understand that they had never left at all. The brass key gleamed in the morning light, positioned exactly where it belonged, 30 centimeters from where I remembered placing it the night before. Story 14. The morning I decided to visit the memorial, the hotel concierge's expression shifted almost imperceptibly when I mentioned the location. A micro flinch, barely noticeable, before he provided directions with the mechanical precision of someone who'd given them countless times. He handed me a tourist map, his fingertips avoiding mine as if the paper itself carried some contagion. The bus ride took 43 minutes through Hanover's orderly suburbs, each stop announced in that distinctly German cadence that made every destination sound like a bureaucratic procedure. I'd come to this city for work, 3 days of mind-numbing conferences about logistics software that paid well enough to justify the jet lag. But today was mine, and something had drawn me to this place whose name I'd glimpsed in a guidebook the night before. The final stop deposited me beside a narrow path that wound through dense pine forest. No other passengers disembarked. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving me alone with the sound of wind moving through branches overhead, a constant whisper that seemed to carry words just beyond comprehension. The path led deeper into woods that grew increasingly quiet. My footsteps on the packed earth sounded too loud, too intrusive. Even the birds had fallen silent by the time I reached the clearing. It opened before me like a wound in the forest, a perfect circle of bare ground surrounded by towering pines. The silence here was absolute, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. Scattered throughout the clearing were stones, some waist-high, others barely emerging from the earth. Each bore engraved text in multiple languages, names and dates, etched with surgical precision. I approached the nearest stone and began to read. The names meant nothing to me, but the dates created their own narrative. Lives that had flickered and died within mere decades of each other. Some stones recorded entire families, their birth dates clustered within years, their end dates identical, the mathematics of loss. As I moved from stone to stone, cataloging the inscriptions with the methodical attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle, I became aware of the wind. It had picked up, but strangely, brushing against my coat's hem, tugging at the fabric around my legs, yet the pine boughs above remained perfectly still. Not a single needle trembled. The contrast was so striking that I stopped mid-step and looked up, watching those motionless branches while the wind continued to play around my ankles like curious fingers. I pulled my coat tighter and continued reading, but the sensation persisted. The wind seemed to follow me, always at ground level, always personal. When I knelt to examine a particularly weathered inscription, it rustled the papers in my jacket pocket. When I stood, it traced the outline of my silhouette, but above, the forest canopy remained frozen in perfect stillness. Near the clearing's center stood a modest building, its concrete walls the color of old bone. A small sign identified it as the information center, though the term seemed inadequate for the weight of silence that emanated from its open doorway. I hesitated at the threshold, struck by the sudden certainty that crossing it would change something fundamental, that I would not emerge the same person who entered. The feeling was ridiculous, the kind of dramatic notion that belonged in bad movies, not in the middle of a Tuesday morning in Lower Saxony. I stepped inside. The interior was larger than the exterior had suggested, with corridors branching off in directions that seemed geometrically impossible given the building's footprint. The main hall stretched before me, its walls lined with display cases and photographs. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but their illumination seemed muted, as if the darkness itself absorbed photons. What struck me immediately were the shadows on the floor, parallel stripes that stretched across the polished concrete in perfect regularity. They moved slowly, so slowly that I had to stare at one spot for several seconds to confirm the motion. The shadows shifted like those cast by bars or railings, but when I looked up, nothing hung from the ceiling that could create such patterns. The fluorescent fixtures ran in straight lines, not the grid that would produce these regular intervals of light and dark. I walked between the stripes, and they seemed to adjust their pace to mine, always maintaining their measured progression across the floor. The sensation of walking through projected prison bars was inescapable, though I knew the comparison was absurd. These were just shadows cast by lighting fixtures, surely. Some trick of architecture that I didn't understand. The displays themselves were what I'd expected. Photographs, documents, personal effects behind glass. The usual careful curation of tragedy that such places required. But reading the placards, I found my attention fragmenting. Words seemed to slide away from comprehension, sentences becoming collections of syllables rather than meaning. Numbers, though. Numbers remained sharp and clear. Dates, ages, quantities. They seemed to leap from the text, while everything else grew indistinct. I was studying a photograph of a group standing before a building I didn't recognize when footsteps approached from behind. A guide materialized beside me, a man in his 60s with the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades navigating conversations about unspeakable things. He nodded toward the photograph I'd been examining and spoke in English with only the faintest accent. The people in the image, he explained, had lived in this area before the war. The building behind them had been demolished decades ago, but the foundation stones had been incorporated into the memorial's construction. He gestured vaguely toward the walls around us, suggesting that we were quite literally surrounded by remnants of that previous life. As he spoke, his voice dropped to nearly a whisper, and he added something that made my skin prickle. He mentioned, almost casually, that some visitors became unusually focused on the numerical information, dates, ages, counts. These people, he said, often reported hearing something when they concentrated too intently. Numbers, usually. Repetitions without source. The way he said it suggested this was neither rare nor entirely unwelcome, as if the memorial expected such responses, accounted for them. He studied my face as he spoke, and I had the uncomfortable sense that he was evaluating my susceptibility to whatever phenomenon he'd described. After he moved on, I found myself drawn back to the displays, but now every number seemed to pulse with significance. Birth years, death years, ages at deportation, weights of possessions left behind. I began to focus on them with an intensity that surprised me, as if they contained some code I was meant to decipher. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the building's ventilation system, a rhythmic sound like pages turning, or paper being shuffled. But as I listened more carefully, the rhythm resolved into something more specific. Numbers being spoken, though without any voice behind them. Just the shape of numerals formed in air, repetitive sequences that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. 4729, 4729, 4729. The sequence repeated with mechanical precision, neither growing louder nor softer, neither speeding up nor slowing down. I turned my head, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When I moved to a different part of the hall, the numbers changed. 8153, 8153, 8153. I realized I was holding my breath, straining to hear more clearly, and forced myself to exhale. The sound continued, unaffected by my presence or attention. It was like discovering a radio signal that had been broadcasting all along, waiting for the right frequency adjustment to become audible. The strangest part was how natural it felt. Not frightening exactly, but significant in a way I couldn't articulate. As if I'd stumbled upon something that had been meant for me to find, a message encoded in the architecture itself. I spent the better part of an hour moving through the halls, listening to the numerical sequences that seemed to permeate each room. Sometimes the numbers were simple, 2 or 3 digits repeated endlessly. Other times they formed longer patterns, complex arrangements that felt almost like equations missing their operators. In one corridor lined with photographs of children's belongings, shoes and toys and school books arranged with museum-quality precision, the numbers came faster, overlapping sequences that created a kind of mathematical symphony. I found myself nodding along to rhythms I didn't understand, my pulse adjusting to match patterns that had no logical basis. It was only when I reached the exit that the true strangeness of my visit became apparent. The departure process was more formal than I'd expected. Rather than simply walking out, visitors were channeled through a narrow corridor where a woman sat at a small desk, collecting the admission badges we'd been given upon entry. I'd forgotten about the badge entirely, a small plastic rectangle on a lanyard that I'd put on automatically and ignored thereafter. When I reached the desk, I lifted the lanyard over my head and handed it across. The woman took it without looking up, then paused. She turned the badge over in her hands, examining it with sudden attention. When she looked up at me, her expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested surprise she was working to conceal. She held up the badge. A diagonal line had been scratched across its surface, not deep, but clearly deliberate. The mark ran from corner to corner, bisecting the memorial's logo like a cancellation stamp. Her English was heavily accented but precise. Had anyone approached me during the visit? Had I set the badge down anywhere? Left it unattended? The questions came with the gentle persistence of someone accustomed to investigating anomalies that weren't supposed to occur. I assured her that no one had touched me, that the badge had remained around my neck the entire time. This was true. I was certain of it. In the memorial's hushed environment, any physical contact would have been immediately noticeable. The badge had hung beneath my coat, protected from accidental contact. She made a note on a form I couldn't read, filed the scratched badge in a drawer that seemed to contain others like it, and handed me a replacement for the exit turnstile. Her smile was professional but distant, the kind reserved for situations that fell outside normal parameters. The bus ride back to Hanover passed in a haze of confusion. I replayed the visit obsessively, trying to identify the moment when the scratching might have occurred. The more I considered it, the more impossible it seemed. The badge had been secure, my movements carefully controlled in that environment of enforced reverence. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Someone, or something, had marked that badge with the unmistakable gesture of completion. A line drawn through finished business. Back at the hotel, I researched the memorial online, looking for some context that might explain what I'd experienced. The official websites were sparse, offering the expected historical background and visiting information. But deeper searches revealed fragments of stranger material, forum posts from other visitors who'd reported unusual experiences, academic papers about location-specific auditory phenomena, and one particularly unsettling blog entry from a researcher who'd spent months documenting similar reports. The blog described a pattern. Visitors who became fixated on numerical data often reported hearing sequences without identifiable sources. Some left with damaged admission badges, always marked with the same diagonal scratch. The researcher had attempted to correlate these incidents with specific areas of the memorial, specific times of day, even specific meteorological conditions. No pattern emerged. What disturbed me most was a comment thread beneath the blog post, where several visitors described their own experiences. The details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The selective wind that moved only at ground level, the shifting shadows without corresponding objects, the numbers that seemed to speak themselves. One commenter mentioned returning to the memorial multiple times, drawn by a compulsion they couldn't explain, only to find their subsequent visits utterly normal. No unusual sounds, no marked badges, no strange shadows, as if the place had finished with them. I closed the laptop and tried to focus on the conference schedule for the following day, but the numbers I'd heard continued to echo in my memory. 4729, 8153. Dozens of other sequences, each as clear and meaningless as when I'd first heard them. That night, I dreamed of walking through corridors lined with scratched badges, thousands of them arranged like scales on some massive creature. In the dream, I could read the numbers on each badge, and they formed a sequence so long and complex that my sleeping mind couldn't hold it all. When I woke, only fragments remained: 771, 2894, 555. The final day of the conference passed without incident. I attended sessions on inventory management and supply chain optimization, took notes I'd never reference, exchanged business cards I'd never use. The familiar routine of professional obligation should have restored normalcy, but I found myself checking my reflection throughout the day, looking for some mark that would confirm the memorial visit had been real, rather than an elaborate hallucination. At the airport, boarding the flight home, I realized I was counting things compulsively. Gate numbers, seat assignments, the digits on my boarding pass. Each number felt weighted with significance I couldn't decode, as if they were part of some vast equation I was meant to solve. The plane lifted off from Hanover at 6:47 p.m. local time. As the city fell away beneath us, I pressed my face to the window and tried to locate the forest where the memorial stood. From this altitude, the landscape was just patches of green and brown, indistinguishable from each other. If the clearing was down there, It was invisible among the trees. But as we gained altitude, climbing toward the clouds that would hide Germany from view, I could swear I heard something beneath the engine noise, a familiar rhythm, numbers being spoken without voice, sequences that had followed me from that place of measured silence into the ordinary world above. 4729, 8153, over and over, as steady as heartbeat, as patient as erosion. I closed my eyes and let the numbers wash over me, wondering if I would ever understand what they meant, or if understanding was even the point. Perhaps some messages weren't meant to be decoded, only received. Perhaps some places marked their visitors not with knowledge, but with questions that could never be fully answered. The scratched badge was gone, disposed of in the memorial's collection of inexplicable artifacts. But the numbers remained, and I suspected they always would. A frequency I'd been tuned to receive, a signal that would follow me home and into whatever came after. The plane flew on through the darkening sky, carrying me away from Hanover and toward a future where I would never again hear silence without listening for the numbers hidden within it. And in that listening, I would remember the clearing where the wind moved only at ground level, where shadows fell without objects to cast them, and where someone or something had marked my visit complete with a single diagonal line, as if to say, counted, as if to say, recorded, as if to say, you were here, and now you will always be part of what happened here. The numbers continued their patient recitation as we crossed above the clouds, and I understood that my visit to the memorial was not ending with this flight home, but beginning something else entirely. A lifetime of carrying sequences I would never decode, in a language I would never fully speak, from a place that had claimed me in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Story 15. The keys felt heavier than they should have as I climbed the narrow stairwell to the 4th floor. Each step echoed against the peeling wallpaper, a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to announce my arrival to the building's shadows. The fluorescent light on the 3rd floor landing flickered with that particular urgency of something dying, casting intermittent pools of sickly yellow across the worn carpet. Mrs. Chen from 4B had asked me 3 weeks prior, catching me by the mailboxes with that apologetic smile neighbors wear when they need something. She was heading to Portland to visit family, she'd said, and her 2 cats needed looking after. Simple enough. Feed them twice daily, clean the litter box, make sure they had fresh water. The kind of favor that makes you feel useful without demanding too much. The first night had been unremarkable. The cats, both large orange tabbies named something I couldn't pronounce, had regarded me with the typical feline mixture of curiosity and disdain. I'd filled their bowls, scooped their box, and left after 20 minutes of one-sided conversation about how good they were being. Walking back down those stairs, I'd felt satisfied with my good deed, already anticipating the small payment Mrs. Chen had insisted upon. The second night changed everything. I arrived at 7:30, same as before, keys jingling against each other in that familiar metallic whisper. The cats greeted me at the door, which struck me as odd. They'd hidden under the couch the previous evening. Now they wound around my legs with an urgency that seemed less about affection and more about warning. The apartment felt different. Not wrong exactly, but charged with the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms. The air hung thick and still, despite the October chill seeping through the old windows. Even the usual city sounds, car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the L train, seemed muffled, as if the apartment had wrapped itself in cotton. I went through the motions. Fresh water in both bowls, though they seemed to have barely touched yesterday's. The dry food crunched under my feet as I measured out their dinner, the cats watching from the kitchen doorway rather than rushing to eat as they had before. Their eyes reflected the overhead light in twin pairs of green coins, unblinking and fixed on something behind me. The litter box sat in the small bathroom off the hallway, tucked between the toilet and a cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. As I worked, scooping and cleaning, the cats followed but remained in the doorway, their bodies pressed low to the ground. When I finished and sealed the box, that's when I heard it. My name, not shouted or whispered, but called in that particular way someone uses when they're in another room and need your attention. Clear, distinct, familiar somehow, though I couldn't place the voice. It came from the direction of the kitchen, carrying that slight upturn that suggested a question. I froze, plastic scoop still in my hand, listening to my heartbeat drum against my eardrums. The cats had gone completely rigid, their fur standing on end along their spines like tiny mountain ranges of alarm. Neither moved, but their heads had swiveled toward the sound, confirming I hadn't imagined it. The kitchen was empty, of course, but the water bowls I just filled were different. Fuller, the water reaching the very brim of each ceramic dish in perfect trembling meniscus. I'd been careful not to overfill them, had specifically stopped when they were about 3/4 full to avoid spills. Now they sat like small mirrors, so full that the slightest vibration would send water cascading onto the linoleum. My hands shook as I bent to examine them. The water was cold, fresh, with none of the slightly stale smell tap water develops when it sits, as if someone had just finished filling them moments before I entered the room. The cats had not followed me. When I returned to the hallway, I found them exactly where I'd left them. 2 orange sentinels guarding the bathroom door, their eyes now fixed on the dark corridor that led to the apartment's rear. Their bodies formed a barrier, as if something in those shadows required watching. I should have left then. Should have grabbed my jacket from the kitchen chair and headed for the door with some muttered excuse about forgetting an appointment. Instead, I found myself drawn deeper into the apartment, past the cats who watched my progress with what I could only describe as disappointment. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. The apartment was a standard 2-bedroom layout, nothing fancy, but the corridor seemed to telescope as I walked, each step taking me further from the familiar kitchen sounds and into a silence so complete it felt solid. The floorboards, which had creaked under my weight near the front door, now accepted my footsteps without protest, as if the building itself had learned to muffle sound. At the end of the hall sat a closed door. Mrs. Chen's bedroom, I assumed, though we'd never discussed it. Light seeped from beneath it, a warm yellow glow that suggested a bedside lamp left on. But Mrs. Chen was in Portland. Had been for 2 days already. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching that strip of light and listening for any sound from within. The apartment's heating system chose that moment to kick on, sending a shudder through the walls and floors that made me jump. When my nerves settled, the light beneath the door seemed dimmer, as if someone inside had turned a lamp to a lower setting. The walk back to the kitchen felt like emerging from deep water. The cats remained at their post, though they'd relaxed slightly, no longer bristling with alarm but maintaining their vigilant postures. I gathered my jacket and headed for the door, pausing only to double-check that I'd locked everything properly. Mrs. Chen had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the apartment's previous tenant hadn't left under the best circumstances. She'd been vague about details, her English becoming more heavily accented when she seemed uncomfortable. Something about an ambulance and the woman never returning for her belongings. The landlord had eventually cleared everything out, but you know how it is with apartments, she'd said. They hold on to things. I'd thought she meant dust and cooking smells, the accumulated weight of someone's life embedded in the walls. Now, descending those stairs with my heart still racing, I wondered what else might linger in a place where someone had been carried away on a stretcher. The third night, I almost didn't go. I sat in my own apartment 2 floors down, staring at Mrs. Chen's keys on my coffee table, and trying to convince myself that the cats could skip one evening of human attention. They had food and water, or at least, they had water, whether I'd provided it or not. But responsibility won out, as it usually does. At 8 o'clock, I climbed those stairs again, noting how the building seemed quieter than usual. Mr. Martinez's television, typically blaring through his thin walls, was silent. The woman in 3A who played piano at odd hours, nothing. Even the street noise felt distant, as if the building had detached itself from the city around it. The cats were waiting inside the door, but their behavior had changed again. Instead of the previous night's alertness, they seemed almost resigned, following me through the apartment with the weary patience of guards on a long watch. They ate mechanically while I stood in the kitchen, trying not to look at the water bowls that were, once again, filled to impossible precision. The voice came earlier this time. I was still in the kitchen when I heard my name called from the bathroom. The same tone, the same questioning inflection. The cats didn't react at all, continuing to eat as if they'd grown accustomed to phantom voices. This time, I followed the sound. The bathroom was exactly as I'd left it. Clean litter box, towels hanging neatly on their rack. But the mirror above the sink had fogged over despite the cool apartment temperature, and in that condensation, someone had written a single word: stay. Not stay like a command, but stay with a capital S, written in careful cursive letters that were already beginning to fade as I watched. The handwriting looked feminine, elegant, with the kind of loops and flourishes they used to teach in school decades ago. I reached out to touch the mirror, then stopped, my finger inches from the glass. The reflection staring back at me looked wrong somehow, not in any way I could articulate, but wrong nonetheless. As if the person in the mirror was looking at something I couldn't see, focused on a point just over my left shoulder. I spun around. Empty bathroom, empty hallway beyond. The cats had finished eating and were making their way toward their usual evening spots. One on the windowsill, one on the couch. Normal cat behavior in an apartment that was becoming anything but normal. The fourth night brought rain, a steady drumming against the windows that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like percussion, marking time until something I couldn't name. Mrs. Chen was due back in 3 days. I'd started counting down, marking off each evening on a mental calendar. The apartment felt colder, though the heat was running at its usual setting. I found myself rubbing my arms as I went through the feeding routine, my breath visible in small puffs despite the closed windows. The cats seemed unaffected, but they'd taken to following me everywhere, staying within arm's reach as if they'd appointed themselves as escorts. The water bowls were full again, and this time I decided to empty them. I poured out the pristine water and refilled them to what I considered a reasonable level. Within minutes of turning away, I heard the soft sound of water being poured. When I looked back, both bowls were filled to the brim again, the meniscus trembling with fresh disturbance. I repeated the experiment 3 times. Same result each time. The water appeared as soon as I stopped watching, poured by hands I couldn't see using a source I couldn't identify. On the 4th attempt, I kept my eyes fixed on the bowls, determined to catch whatever was happening. The water level rose slowly, as if someone was pouring very carefully to avoid splashing, but there was no pitcher, no person, no visible source, just water climbing the ceramic walls until it reached that perfect, impossible fullness. The sound of pouring was clear and distinct, the gentle glug-glug of liquid leaving a container, but there was nothing there to see. That's when the temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began coming in visible clouds. The cats retreated to the living room, and I followed them, no longer willing to remain in that kitchen where physics seemed to have taken a leave of absence. I left early that night, but not before I heard my name called from every room in the apartment. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, even what sounded like the hallway closet. Not in distress or anger, but with that same questioning tone, as if someone was looking for me and couldn't understand why I wouldn't answer. Mrs. Chen returned on schedule, knocking on my door with a tired smile and a small envelope containing my payment. She asked how the cats had been, and I told her they were fine, which was true enough. When she asked if there had been any problems with the apartment, I hesitated. She must have seen something in my expression because her smile faded slightly. We stood there in my doorway, 2 people who shared a building but not a language for discussing the impossible. Finally, she mentioned that the previous tenant had been an elderly woman who'd lived there for 30 years. Very quiet, very neat, never any trouble. Then one morning, the woman in the apartment below had heard water running constantly and called the super. They'd found the old woman collapsed in her bathroom, the sink overflowing, water everywhere. She'd had a stroke, Mrs. Chen explained, and had been calling for help for hours before anyone heard. The ambulance had taken her to Northwestern Memorial, Mrs. Chen continued, but she'd never been conscious enough to give them any information. No family could be located. No friends came forward. She'd died 2 weeks later, and her belongings had been cleared out by the county. But you know how it is, Mrs. Chen repeated, using the same phrase as before. Apartments hold on to things. I thanked her for trusting me with the cats and closed the door, but her words followed me around my own apartment for days. The old woman had been calling for help, and no one had answered. She'd died alone in a hospital, nameless and unclaimed. That might have been the end of it, except for the keys. Mrs. Chen had given me a single key to her apartment, a basic brass key that looked like 1,000 others. But when I'd been caring for the cats, I'd carried my entire key ring, and the sound of Mrs. Chen's key brushing against my others had become familiar. A soft metallic whisper, distinct from the heavier clank of my own keys. Now, weeks later, every time I unlock my own door, I hear it. That same soft whisper of key against key, but I don't have Mrs. Chen's key anymore. I returned it the day she came back, watched her slip it into her purse with a word of thanks. Yet the sound persists, and with it comes the memory of my name being called in that questioning tone, as if someone is still looking for me in rooms I can no longer enter. Sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet, I hear water running in the pipes. It starts somewhere above me, maybe the 4th floor, maybe higher, and continues for hours. The super has checked repeatedly, but he never finds anything wrong. No leaks, no running taps, no explanation for the sound that keeps me awake. I've considered moving, but where would I go? If the old woman couldn't find peace in a hospital room, couldn't rest even in death, what makes me think she'd be bound by the walls of 4B? I'm the one who heard her calling. I'm the one who saw her careful handwriting in the mirror fog. I'm the one who knows she's still looking for someone to answer. The cats are doing well, Mrs. Chen tells me when we meet in the lobby. They've been much calmer since she returned, sleeping through the night, eating normally. She's grateful for the care I provided during that difficult time. I smile and tell her it was no trouble at all, which is both true and completely false. Because trouble suggests something temporary, something that can be resolved. What I experienced in that apartment continues with me, carried in the sound of my keys and the memory of a voice that knew my name before I'd ever heard it. Every night, I lock my door and listen to that familiar metallic whisper. And every night, I wonder if this will be the evening I finally answer when my name is called from a room I haven't entered yet, a room that might not exist until the moment I acknowledge the voice calling from within it. The 4th floor is quiet now, Mrs. Chen says, but quiet doesn't mean empty, and empty doesn't mean gone. Some things once heard can never quite be unheard. Some voices once recognized will keep calling until they're finally answered. I still have my keys. I still climb stairs every day to reach my apartment. And somewhere in the sound of metal against metal, in the whisper of brass on brass, a voice continues to call my name with the patient persistence of someone who has all the time in the world to wait for an answer.